federal agents arrived in the pristine Disney-designed town of Celebration, Florida, expecting to serve a routine warrant for healthcare fraud, a $1 million insurance scam. Instead, they stepped into a waking nightmare. As the door opened, the sweet, cloying scent of advanced decomposition filled the air, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns outside. Anthony Todd stood in the hallway, dazed and clutching a bottle of Benadryl. Behind him, in the master bedroom, lay the mummified remains of his wife, their 3 young children, and the family dog, all wrapped in blankets and left to rot for weeks while Tony continued to live among them. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the carnage in Florida, one must look back to a bedroom in Pennsylvania 40 years earlier. In 1980, the Todd family name first entered the criminal annals when Anthony's father, Robert Todd, a respected special education teacher and wrestling coach, was accused of a cold-blooded assassination plot. Robert was involved in a scandalous affair with one of his former students and sought a permanent exit from his marriage. He hired a man named John Gearhart to enter his home and execute his wife, Loretta, while Robert established an alibi at a local wrestling match. 4-year-old Anthony was in the house when the gunman entered the master bedroom and shot Loretta in the face. Against all odds, she survived the bullet to her head, though the trauma left a permanent scar on the family's psyche. During the subsequent trial, a young Anthony reportedly told investigators that he saw a man in the house, a witness to the violence that his father had orchestrated. Despite Loretta eventually forgiving Robert and even supporting his appeals, the father was convicted of attempted murder and solicitation, serving several years in prison. This warped blueprint of family mercy and domestic violence would eventually resurface in Anthony's own adult life. Anthony sought to build a life that functioned as a rejection of his father's legacy. He became a high achiever, earning a degree in physical therapy and establishing himself as a pillar of the community in Colchester, Connecticut. He was the kind of man who volunteered at his children's schools and was known for his gentle demeanor with patients. He married Megan, a fellow physical therapist and talented yoga instructor whose devotion to her family and her faith was well known among their social circles. Together, they built Family Physical Therapy, a business that seemed from the outside to be a lucrative success. By all accounts, the couple was raising 3 bright, active children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe. The family was deeply involved in music and sports, seemingly living a life of abundance. However, by the mid-2000s, a hidden decay began to rot the foundations of their prosperity. Megan's health began to fail as she struggled with chronic Lyme disease and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, conditions that caused her significant physical pain and led her to withdraw from her professional duties. As her health declined, Anthony's control over the family's finances and narrative tightened. In an attempt to secure a fresh start and escape the cold Connecticut winters, the family began transitioning to Celebration, Florida, a town specifically designed by the Walt Disney Company to evoke a sense of mid-century American perfection. Celebration was an architectural marvel of nostalgia, where hidden speakers in the bushes played Disney soundtracks and the streets were lined with meticulously curated white picket fences. The Tots moved into a 2-story home on North Shore Drive, paying a monthly rent of $4,800, a figure that Anthony could not afford. While the family enjoyed the Florida sunshine, Anthony was living a frantic double life, commuting back to Connecticut during the week to manage his clinics. Behind the scenes, he was drowning in a sea of predatory debt, having taken out more than 20 merchant cash advances from various lenders. These high-interest loans were draining his accounts faster than he could replenish them. To bridge the gap, Anthony turned to a massive systemic scheme of healthcare fraud. Investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services later discovered that Anthony had misappropriated over $130,000 through fraudulent insurance claims. He was billing Medicaid for therapy sessions that never happened, often claiming he had seen patients on days when the clinic was closed or the patients were not even in the state. He even billed for Megan's services long after her illnesses had made it impossible for her to work. As federal agents began closing in during late 2019, Anthony realized that his Disney-designed utopia was a house of cards. The pressure of the impending legal collapse, combined with his increasingly erratic religious delusions about an upcoming apocalypse and the need for salvation, created a volatile psychological cocktail. He began telling relatives that the family needed to move on to a better place, a statement that was misinterpreted as a simple relocation, but in Anthony's mind, it carried a much darker final meaning. The professional union of Anthony and Megan Todt began in the clinical, sterile hallways of their training in the early 1990s. Both were students of physical therapy, drawn together by a shared ambition to heal and a mutual understanding of the human body's mechanics. In those early years, the relationship was defined by a synchronized drive for upward mobility. They weren't just a couple, they were a burgeoning medical brand. Shortly after their marriage, they established their practice in Connecticut, a venture that relied heavily on Megan's clinical brilliance and Tony's gregarious, high-energy personality. In the affluent suburbs of Colchester, they were viewed as the gold standard of domestic and professional success. Neighbors recalled the couple as inseparable, often seen together at community events or managing the daily operations of their multiple clinics. As their business flourished, the family grew with the arrival of Alec, Tyler, and finally, little Zoe. The children were the center of a carefully curated universe. Alec and Tyler were known in the neighborhood as talented musicians and athletes, while Zoe was the spirited youngest who followed her mother everywhere. Tony took immense pride in his role as the patriarch, often framing his identity around his ability to provide a life of luxury. He wanted his children to have every advantage: private lessons, the best gear, and a home that felt like a sanctuary. Behind the front door, the household was characterized by an intense, almost claustrophobic closeness. Megan, despite her professional background, began to lean more heavily into her role as a homemaker as her health began to deteriorate, leaving the logistical and financial burdens of their empire solely on Tony's shoulders. The shift in their relationship dynamic was subtle at first, anchored in Megan's declining physical state. As the Lyme disease and other autoimmune issues took hold, she transitioned from a vibrant therapist to a woman often confined to her bed by chronic pain. This health crisis acted as a catalyst for a profound shift in the family's spiritual life. No longer finding sufficient answers in traditional medicine, the very field they had dedicated their lives to, the couple began to explore more esoteric and fringe religious concepts. They didn't just attend church, they began to construct a private theology centered on cleansing and salvation. Friends noticed that Megan had become increasingly fixated on the idea of an afterlife, a place where she would finally be free from the prison of her failing body. Tony, ever the provider, adapted to this new reality by becoming her spiritual protector, reinforcing the idea that the world outside was a source of toxicity and corruption. This burgeoning religious obsession created a pressure cooker environment. Tony began to describe the family's future in terms of a transition or a move to a higher plane. He told those close to him that the family needed to be prepared for an upcoming spiritual reckoning, though he always framed these discussions within the context of their shared faith. The move to Celebration, Florida in 2017 was the physical manifestation of this desire to escape. They weren't just moving for the weather, they were moving to a town that promised a controlled, safe reality, a place where the Disney veneer could mask the growing cracks in their foundation. In Celebration, the Todts lived a life that appeared idyllic. They were the family that rode bikes through the wood-plinked trails and attended community festivals. However, the cost of maintaining this illusion was staggering. Tony was essentially supporting two separate lives, the Florida fantasy and the failing Connecticut business. The commute took a heavy toll. He would spend long weeks in Connecticut, staying in a cramped apartment or even at the clinic, only to fly back to Florida on the weekends to play the role of the perfect father. This physical separation increased the insulation of the family unit in Celebration. Since the children were homeschooled and Megan rarely left the house due to her pain, Tony became their only link to the outside world. He was the filter through which all information passed. He managed the mail, the phone calls, and the mounting stack of eviction notices and legal threats that began to accumulate at both their Connecticut and Florida addresses. By 2019, the relationship had entered a dark, codependent phase. Megan's reliance on Tony was absolute, and Tony's need to remain her hero was pathological. He could not bring himself to admit that they were broke, that they were being evicted, or that the FBI was monitoring his bank accounts. Instead of admitting failure, he leaned further into their shared delusions. He reinforced Megan's fears about the darkness of the world and the necessity of staying together as a family at any cost. He told her that he was handling the finances, that everything was fine, and that they would soon be moving to a place where pain no longer existed. This wasn't just a lie to his wife. It was a narrative he was desperately trying to sell to himself. The more the walls of reality closed in, the more the merchant lenders called, and the more the federal agents knocked, the more Tony retreated into the role of the savior who would deliver his family from the coming storm. The Disney town, with its manufactured happiness and scripted perfection, provided the perfect stage for this final tragic performance. The transition from the clinical reality of Connecticut to the manufactured bliss of celebration occurred in the final weeks of December 2019. Anthony arrived at the North Shore Drive residence, carrying the weight of a multi-agency federal investigation and the crushing realization that his financial house of cards had finally collapsed. The Disney lifestyle was no longer a refuge, it had become a trap. According to the timeline later reconstructed by investigators, the cleansing began sometime between December 14th and the Christmas holiday. This was not a sudden explosion of domestic rage, but a slow, methodical progression into madness, a ritualistic exit orchestrated by a man who believed he was the only one capable of saving his family from an impending spiritual and social apocalypse. Tony would later provide varying accounts of who initiated the violence, but the physical evidence painted a picture of a calculated, pharmaceutical-grade execution. He began by preparing what he viewed as a sacrament, massive doses of Benadryl. He told detectives that he and Megan had spent hours discussing the necessity of leaving this world together to reach a higher plane where her physical pain would vanish and the children would be protected from the darkness Tony saw closing in. He described a household thick with religious fervor and the scent of incense, where the line between reality and delusion had completely dissolved. The first to be cleaved from the world was the youngest, Zoe. Tony recounted how he sat on her bed while she slept, holding her hand. He described the process of ensuring she had consumed enough of the sedative to be unconscious before he proceeded. He told investigators that he used his own weight to suffocate her, claiming that he wanted her passing to be as peaceful as possible. He spoke of it not as a murder, but as a release. After her breath stopped, he moved her small body to the master bedroom, placing her on the bed that would eventually become a communal altar for the entire family. Next were the boys, Alec and Tyler. The atmosphere in the house had become increasingly heavy, yet Tony maintained a calm, paternal mask. He approached his sons under the guise of a nighttime ritual. He would later claim that Megan was present, watching, and even assisting, though forensic experts would find no evidence to support her active participation in the physical acts of violence. Tony described the struggle with the older boys, how their youthful strength required more than just the sedative. He admitted to using a knife, a detail that stood in grim contrast to his narrative of peaceful passage. He told detectives that he stabbed them to ensure they would not wake up in the darkness. The clinical precision of a physical therapist was used here to find the most efficient path to death. Alec was found with a stab wound to the abdomen. Tyler had been handled with similar finality. He described the boys' confusion in their final moments, yet he framed their deaths as a necessary mercy, a way to keep the family unit unbroken. Megan was the final human life to be extinguished. Tony's account of her death was the most convoluted, shifting between claims of a suicide pact and a mercy killing. He described how they lay together on the bed, surrounded by their children. He told investigators that she was in a state of religious ecstasy, eager to join Zoe, Alec, and Tyler. He claimed he stabbed her at her own request, a claim that the medical examiner would later view with extreme skepticism given the nature of the wounds. Once Megan was dead, Tony turned his attention to the final member of the household, Breezy, the family's loyal dog. He told detectives that Breezy had to go with them, as no one could be left behind in the toxic world. He described the act of killing the dog with the same detached, ritualistic tone he used for his children. What followed was perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the entire case: the weeks of silence. For the remainder of December and the first 13 days of January, Anthony Todt lived in the house with the remains of his family. He did not flee. He did not call for help. Instead, he maintained a macabre domesticity. He told investigators that he spent those weeks praying, waiting for the apocalypse he believed was imminent and preparing himself to join them. He kept the air conditioning at the North Shore Drive house set to a low, bone-chilling temperature in a futile attempt to slow the inevitable process of decay. He lived in the kitchen and the living room, occasionally venturing into the master bedroom to sit with the bodies, which he had carefully wrapped in blankets. He described the peace he felt in the house, even as the biological reality of 5 decomposing bodies began to permeate the walls. During this period, Tony continued to interact with the outside world via his cell phone. He sent texts to relatives in Connecticut, crafting a narrative that the family was sick with the flu and needed privacy to recover. He used Megan's phone to send messages, miming her voice to reassure her worried mother and siblings. He spoke of the family moving on and going to a better place, phrases that were interpreted by his family as plans for a new home, but which Tony intended as a literal description of their state. He watched from the windows as the Disney-designed Christmas festivals took place just blocks away. The artificial snow falling on Market Street, the carolers, the families in matching sweaters, while he sat in the dark, cold interior of a house that had become a tomb. He told detectives that he viewed the outside world as a hologram of sin, and that he had successfully moved his family into the real world through his actions. As the calendar turned to 2020, the physical reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The smell, described by later responders as a physical weight, began to seep through the vents. Tony became increasingly dazed, consuming Benadryl in what he claimed were multiple attempts to take his own life. He told investigators that the timing wasn't right, or that he was being held back by a spiritual force. He existed in a state of high-functioning catatonia, managing to answer the door when a landlord's representative came by, yet failing to acknowledge the horror just a few feet away. He had constructed a world where he was the hero of a tragedy, a man who had sacrificed everything to keep his family together in the afterlife. The Disney town of celebration, with its emphasis on happily ever after, had provided the perfect, ironic backdrop for a man who had decided that the only way to achieve that happiness was through the total annihilation of his own bloodline. While the interior of the North Shore Drive residence remained frozen in a refrigerated, silent stasis, the world outside began to vibrate with a mounting, frantic energy. The first fractures in Anthony's narrative appeared not in the manufactured perfection of Florida, but in the tight-knit communities of Connecticut. Relatives who were used to a constant stream of photos, holiday plans, and boisterous phone calls from the Todt children suddenly found themselves met with a wall of digital noise. Messages sent to Megan's phone were returned with uncharacteristic brevity. The responses claimed the entire household had been leveled by a brutal strain of the flu, that the kids were constantly sleeping, that Megan was too exhausted to even hold the device to her ear. By late December, the silence had become a physical weight for Megan's family. Her sister, remaining in the Northeast, grew increasingly unsettled by the lack of a traditional Christmas morning greeting. It was a digital ghost town. When relatives pressed for a phone call, Anthony, using Megan's accounts, replied that the family needed total isolation to recover. He painted a picture of a house in recovery, while in reality, he was the only living soul moving through the darkened rooms. This period of digital kidnapping allowed Anthony to buy nearly a month of time, but it also sowed the seeds of suspicion that would eventually lead to the front door. In celebration, the neighbors began to notice the subtle signs of a house that had died while its lights were still on. The North Shore Drive neighborhood was one where the absence of a trash can on pickup day or a lawn slightly overgrown was a point of discussion. People noticed that the Todt family's bicycle rides had ceased. The blinds remained tightly drawn, even on the brightest Florida afternoons. Some residents later recalled thinking the family had simply moved back north without saying goodbye. a common occurrence in a town where many properties served as seasonal retreats. Yet the black SUV remained in the driveway, a silent, unmoving sentinel that suggested someone was still there. The first formal intervention occurred on December 29th. Concerned relatives in Connecticut had finally contacted the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, requesting a welfare check. A deputy arrived at the manicured lawn, walked up the steps, and knocked. There was no answer. He peered through the windows, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no chaos. He noted that the house was quiet and reported back that it appeared the family was simply away. It was a standard procedure, a no-contact result that happens dozens of times a day in law enforcement, but in this instance, it was a catastrophic missed opportunity. As the calendar flipped to January 2020, the pressure from the north intensified. Megan's family was no longer accepting the flu excuse. They began reaching out to local celebration Facebook groups, asking if anyone had seen the children. At the same time, the landlord of the North Shore Drive property was dealing with his own growing frustration. The Tots were months behind on rent, and an eviction notice had already been filed. A representative for the landlord visited the house in early January. He later described the eerie sensation of standing on the porch, noticing a faint, unpleasant odor that he initially attributed to a backed-up sewer line or a dead rodent in the crawl space. He knocked, but the only response was the deep, heavy silence of the Disney-designed interior. The search for the Todd family was never a traditional manhunt or a missing persons case with flyers on every pole. It was a slow-motion collision between two separate worlds, the family's personal concern and the federal government's professional pursuit. While the deputies in Florida were treating the situation as a routine welfare check, federal agents from the Department of Health and Human Services and the FBI were finalizing their case against Anthony for healthcare fraud. They weren't looking for a killer. They were looking for a man who had stolen over $100,000 from the state. On January 9th, another welfare check was requested. Again, deputies arrived at the house. This time, they noticed that the air conditioning was running at an extremely high intensity for a winter month, even by Florida standards. They knocked, they walked the perimeter, they checked the doors and found them locked. Because there was no immediate evidence of a crime, no exigent circumstances, the officers lacked the legal authority to kick in the door. They left a business card in the doorframe and drove away. Inside, Anthony sat in the cold, watching the shadow of the patrol car disappear from the driveway. He would later tell investigators that he viewed these visits as tests of his faith, believing that if the world was truly ending, the authorities would have no power to find him. The tension reached its breaking point on the morning of January 13th, 2020. The federal agents arrived with a warrant for Anthony's arrest. They were accompanied by local deputies, prepared to finally put an end to the fraud investigation. When they approached the house, they noticed the business card from the previous visit was still wedged in the door. The smell, which had been a faint nuisance weeks prior, was now an undeniable, sickly sweet wall of scent that permeated the porch. As they forced entry, they didn't find a fleeing suspect. They found a man who appeared to have aged decades in a matter of weeks. Anthony was staggering, his speech slurred from the massive amounts of Benadryl he had ingested. He was clutching a bottle of the sedative like a talisman. When agents asked where his family was, he gestured toward the stairs with a vacant, hollow stare. The agents ascended to the master bedroom, expecting perhaps to find a family hiding from the law. Instead, they stepped into a tomb. The cold air from the maxed-out AC unit hit them first, followed by the sight of the blankets. The search had ended, but the true horror was just beginning. The agents realized that for nearly 4 weeks, while they were filing paperwork and tracking bank accounts, a father had been living, eating, and sleeping in a house with the mummified remains of everyone he claimed to love. The community of celebration, built on the promise of a perfect life, woke up that morning to find that its white picket fences had been shielding a darkness that Disney's architects could never have imagined. The clinical investigation into the deaths of the Todt family began in a house chilled to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature maintained by a man who had spent weeks watching the physical evidence of his crimes slowly succumb to biology. As forensic teams moved through the North Shore Drive residence, they were met with a scene that defied the standard logic of domestic homicide. There were no signs of a struggle in the common areas, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The carnage was contained entirely within the master bedroom. The initial reports from the scene described the victims as being in various stages of decomposition, wrapped carefully in blankets and placed with a ritualistic intent that suggested a mind untethered from reality. Detectives focused first on the missed opportunities that had allowed Anthony to remain in the house for so long. They scrutinized the logs of the December 29th and January 2nd welfare checks. In both instances, deputies had reported a quiet house with no visible distress. The red herring that had effectively paralyzed the initial response was Anthony's digital manipulation. He had successfully convinced relatives in Connecticut that the family was incapacitated by a severe flu, using the children's and Megan's phones to send reassurances that were just vague enough to buy him time. This digital ghosting created a barrier of privacy that the Fourth Amendment protected, until the federal warrant for healthcare fraud provided the legal key to the front door. The interrogation of Anthony Todt began at a nearby hospital, where he was being treated for a Benadryl overdose. Even in a state of pharmaceutical-induced lethargy, he began to weave a narrative of spiritual necessity. He told the investigators that the plan had been a joint decision between him and Megan, that she had become obsessed with the idea of cleansing their souls to prepare for a coming apocalypse. He claimed that Megan had initiated the violence, even suggesting she was the one who had stabbed the boys. He spoke of their deaths not as a loss, but as a relocation. He described the process of cleansing each child, claiming it was done out of a profound, twisted love. However, as the detectives pressed for specifics, the why became increasingly tied to the how much. Parallel to the homicide investigation, federal agents from the Department of Health and Human Services were dismantling Anthony's professional life. The midpoint pivot in the investigation occurred when detectives realized that the religious delusions were inextricably linked to a massive, looming financial collapse. Anthony's clinic, Family Physical Therapy, was a shell. Investigators discovered that he had taken out over 20 merchant cash advances, predatory loans often referred to as legalized loan sharking. The interest rates were astronomical, and Anthony had been funneling fraudulent Medicaid payments directly into these debts. He was caught in a cycle of billing for patients who had never stepped foot in his clinic, or patients he claimed to have seen while he was actually hundreds of miles away in Florida. The federal agents had been tracking him for months, unaware that as they built their case for fraud, Anthony was building a tomb. The medical examiner's findings provided the final, objective contradiction to Anthony's shifting stories. The autopsy reports for Alec, Tyler, and Zoe revealed high concentrations of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, in their systems. This confirmed that they had been incapacitated before the physical trauma occurred. The presence of stab wounds on the boys and Megan suggested a level of violence that Anthony had attempted to sanitize in his early confessions. The most damning evidence against his claim that Megan was the primary actor was the physical logistics of the crimes. Megan's debilitating physical condition made it highly unlikely she could have carried out the suffocation and stabbing of two athletic teenage boys. The forensic reconstruction indicated that Anthony was the only individual with the physical strength and mental focus to execute the plan. As detectives dug into Anthony's personal history, they found the echoes of his father's 1980 conviction for attempted murder. They looked for a blueprint of violence that might explain his descent. They discovered that Anthony had been telling people for months that he had visions and that the family needed to be prepared to cross over. He had meticulously researched the effects of various sedatives and had spent the final weeks of 2019 isolating his family from any external support. Neighbors who were questioned revealed that Anthony had become increasingly erratic, speaking about the corruption of the outside world and the need to protect his children's purity. The investigation also touched upon the psychological state of the victims. Evidence suggested that the children were entirely unaware of their father's financial crimes or the impending eviction. They were living in a manufactured Disney paradise, trusting the man who claimed to be their protector. The discovery of Zoe's body, the youngest and most vulnerable, sent a ripple of visceral horror through the Osceola County Sheriff's Office. She had been dead for weeks, kept in a bed with her brothers, while her father sat in the next room. This wasn't just a murder, it was a total psychological surrender. Anthony had decided that if he could not be the successful provider he had promised to be, he would instead be the savior who took his family into a world where debts and federal agents could no longer reach them. By the time the formal charges were being prepared, the community of Celebration was in a state of shock. The investigators noted the change in the local atmosphere. The white picket fences and manicured lawns now felt like the walls of a high-security prison. The Disney town had failed to protect its most innocent residents from a man who wore the mask of a devoted father. Every detail of the investigation, from the high-interest loans in Connecticut to the refrigerated air on North Shore Drive, pointed to a singular, terrifying conclusion. Anthony Tott had calculated the value of his family's lives and decided that their deaths were the only way to balance his books. In April 2022, after years of pandemic delays and psychological evaluations, Anthony Tott finally stood before a jury in Osceola County. The man who arrived in court was a shadow of the energetic physical therapist relatives remembered. He looked diminished, his face etched with the weight of 2 years in isolation. The prosecution's case was a clinical dismantling of his spiritual transition defense. They presented the physical evidence of the stab wounds and the toxic levels of diphenhydramine found in the children, shattering the narrative of a peaceful passing. Anthony took the stand in his own defense, a move that legal experts viewed as a final, desperate attempt to control the story. He told the court that he had returned home to find Megan in a trance-like state, claiming she had already released the children to save them from a perceived darkness. He described a scene where he merely assisted in her final moments out of a twisted sense of loyalty. However, the medical examiner testified that the logistics were impossible. Megan's physical state was too weak to carry out such systematic violence. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty, as the word guilty echoed through the silent courtroom. Anthony showed no visible emotion. During sentencing, the judge's words were sharp, describing him as a destroyer of worlds who had wiped out generations of potential. The final judgment was absolute: 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Anthony was led away, destined to spend the rest of his life in the very state-mandated confinement he had killed to avoid, leaving the community of Celebration to begin the slow process of reclaiming its peace. Celebration remains an architectural ideal of mid-century nostalgia, but the silence at the house on North Shore Drive serves as a permanent puncture in that Disney dream. Anthony Tott is now confined to a state-mandated cell, the cold, physical reality he tried to escape through the total annihilation of his family. For those who walk these manicured streets, the white picket fences no longer represent a sanctuary. They serve as a grim reminder that the greatest darkness often hides behind the most polished masks, and that in a town designed for happy endings, some stories can never be redeemed. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. The SpaceX acceptance email sat in Chandler Halderson's inbox, a digital trophy for a 23-year-old on the verge of greatness, or so his parents believed. While Bart and Krista Halderson celebrated their son's supposed move to Florida, Chandler was busy managing a different kind of project. Not aerospace engineering, but human disposal. In July 2021, the digital facade of a brilliant career collided with the physical reality of a fireplace, burning at temperatures high enough to incinerate bone. The core paradox of the Halderson case isn't just the lies, but the gruesome lengths a son went to when those lies finally reached their expiration date. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. The quiet suburb of Windsor, Wisconsin, sits roughly 15 miles north of Madison, a landscape of manicured lawns, 2-car garages, and a silence so profound it usually suggests nothing more than a neighborhood at work. It was here, in a split-level home on a cul-de-sac known as Rural Court, that the Halderson family built a life defined by Midwestern reliability and professional success. Bart Halderson, 50 years old, was the family's anchor, a meticulous accountant and tax specialist who viewed the world through the lens of order and fiscal responsibility. His wife, 53-year-old Krista, balanced his analytical nature with a vibrant social energy, working in customer service, but acting as the emotional glue for their social circle. To the neighbors, the Haldersons were the gold standard of suburban stability, a family that had done everything right. Their older son, Mitchell, had already moved out and established himself in the tech industry, providing a blueprint for the kind of success Bart and Krista expected for their younger son, Chandler. At 23, Chandler remained in the family home, but he didn't seem like a burden. Rather, he appeared to be a young man on a meteoric rise. He was an Eagle Scout, a title that, in the eyes of his community, served as a permanent certificate of character, and he carried himself with a quiet, tech-savvy confidence that suggested he was destined for more than the quiet streets of Windsor. The narrative of Chandler's success was built on a foundation of impressive academic and professional milestones that he shared daily with his parents. According to the version of reality he presented at the dinner table, he was nearing the completion of a degree in renewable energy and engineering at Madison Area Technical College. He spoke of complex coursework and the grueling demands of his schedule, often retreating to his room for hours under the guise of attending virtual lectures or studying for high-stakes exams. Bart and Krista, ever the supportive parents, respected his space, believing they were witnessing the hard work required to transition from student to professional. This perceived ambition seemed to pay off when Chandler announced he had secured a position in the IT department at American Family Insurance. For a young man still in school, it was a prestigious foot in the door, and he described his work there with enough technical jargon to satisfy his father's desire for detail. But the crowning achievement, the news that transformed the Halderson household into a hub of excitement, was the announcement that he had been recruited by SpaceX. Chandler told his parents he was heading to Florida to work for Elon Musk's aerospace giant, a career move so prestigious it felt like a collective victory for the entire family. The transition to Florida was supposedly imminent, but a sudden physical setback seemed to complicate the timeline. Chandler reported that he had suffered a severe fall down the stairs, resulting in a concussion so debilitating he began wearing a medical neck brace around the house. This injury shifted the power dynamic within the home. The ambitious engineer-to-be became a patient, requiring Krista's maternal care and Bart's patience. He claimed the injury prevented him from driving or working long hours, and he often spent his days resting while his parents took over his domestic responsibilities, all while continuing to congratulate him on the bright future that awaited him once he recovered. In Bart's mind, however, the professional logistics weren't adding up with the same precision as his tax ledgers. He noticed that Chandler never seemed to receive a paycheck from American Family Insurance, and the move to Florida was perpetually stalled by administrative glitches that Chandler described with increasing frustration. Bart, the man who spent his life verifying figures, began to feel a nagging urge to verify his son's reality. He didn't suspect a monster. He suspected a son who had lost his way or was being taken advantage of by distant bureaucracies. Little did the meticulous accountant realize that the glitches weren't in the system, they were the system itself. Every email from the college, every job offer, and every medical update was a carefully crafted piece of fiction, a digital house of cards that Chandler was desperately trying to keep from collapsing as his father reached for the phone to call the admissions office. The facade Chandler Halderson built wasn't just a collection of casual lies. It was a comprehensive digital ecosystem designed to mimic the life of a high-achieving professional. His bedroom in the house on Rural Court served as the command center for this artificial reality, a space where the soft glow of dual monitors masked the fact that he hadn't attended a single college class in years. While Bart and Krista believed their son was mastering complex engineering principles, Chandler was actually mastering the art of digital forgery. He didn't just tell them he was enrolled at Madison Area Technical College. He created an infrastructure to prove it. He set up fake email accounts and spoofed phone numbers, populating his inbox with messages from a fictional college advisor he named Omar Jolly. Whenever Bart questioned why his son's tuition was being paid without any visible degree progress, Chandler would simply pull up a carefully crafted email thread. He told his father that administrative errors at the college had resulted in his credits being lost in the system, and he spent hours forwarding these fake correspondences to Bart's own email address. The level of detail was staggering. Chandler even included professional-sounding signatures and technical jargon about server migrations to explain why his transcripts were inaccessible. Bart, ever the meticulous accountant, tried to help. He even offered to sit down with Chandler and call the school together. Chandler, unfazed, would dial the number and pretend to speak with a representative, not realizing his father was watching the audit of his life unfold in real time. In reality, the numbers Chandler called were often his own secondary lines or disconnected numbers intended to lead to a dead end. The deception extended into his professional life with the same mechanical precision. Chandler told his parents and his girlfriend, Catherine, that he had landed a job in the IT department at American Family Insurance. Every morning, he would dress in business casual attire, pack his laptop, and drive away from the house as if heading to a 9-to-5 shift. He described the office culture, complained about specific coworkers, and detailed his frustrations with the company's internal servers. But the work he was doing was purely performative. He would spend those hours at Catherine's house or parked in public lots, playing video games or simply waiting for enough time to pass so he could return home and recount his productive day. The tension in the house began to rise, however, when the paychecks failed to materialize. Chandler explained this away with another layer of fiction. He told Bart that the company's HR department was having issues with his direct deposit, claiming they were recalculating his back pay. To buy more time, he even told a bizarre side lie, claiming he was working as a volunteer police diver for a local department. He told his parents that his specialized skills were needed for underwater recovery missions, which explained why he was often tired or absent at odd hours. It was a brilliant, albeit desperate tactic. It turned his lack of income into an act of community service that his parents felt they couldn't criticize. The crown jewel of his fabrication was the SpaceX recruitment. As the pressure from Bart regarding the MATC degree and the insurance paycheck reached a boiling point, Chandler played his final card. He showed his mother, Krista, an email from a SpaceX HR representative confirming his acceptance into an internship program in Florida. He spoke about security clearances, the logistics of moving to Cape Canaveral, and the excitement of working on the cutting edge of aerospace technology. He even went as far as to discuss the specifics of his salary and the relocation package. For Krista, this was the ultimate validation of her son's talent. But for Bart, the accountant, it was another figure that didn't balance. Bart began to realize that for all the emails and calls, there were no actual documents, no tax forms, no official letters, and no physical proof of employment. Just as Bart began to demand a meeting with the college's financial office to resolve the missing credits once and for all, Chandler introduced a physical component to his lies. He claimed he had suffered a fall down the stairs, resulting in a concussion and a severe neck injury. Suddenly, he was wearing a medical neck brace and moving with a slow, pained gait. This wasn't just a health concern, it was a tactical maneuver. By presenting himself as physically fragile and mentally impaired by a brain injury, he created a shield against his father's interrogation. How could Bart grill a son who was supposedly suffering from dizzy spells and memory loss? Krista's maternal instincts took over, and she became his protector, shushing Bart whenever he tried to bring up the MATC transcripts. Throughout this entire period, Chandler's relationship with Catherine was both his anchor and his most significant audience. She was his biggest supporter, believing every word of his SpaceX fantasy. He shared his plans for their future in Florida, weaving her into a dream that was entirely hollow. He spent his nights gaming with friends, portraying the persona of a stressed, high-level professional, while his parents slept just down the hall, blissfully unaware that their son was a digital ghost. The collision between these two worlds was inevitable. Bart's patience had a limit, and his professional instinct for truth was beginning to override his paternal desire to believe. The audit was coming, and Chandler was running out of digital shadows to hide in. The morning of July 1st, 2021, began with a quiet finality that only a man like Bart Halderson could truly orchestrate. For months, the meticulous accountant had been auditing his own life, and the numbers simply refused to balance. He had reached the end of his patience with the digital shadows and administrative excuses. While Chandler sat in his room, supposedly recovering from a brain injury that required a medical neck brace, Bart was downstairs, finally making the phone call that would dismantle his son's artificial universe. He didn't call a tech support line or a fictional HR representative. He called the admissions office at Madison Area Technical College. The conversation was brief. The reality was stark. The school representative informed Bart that Chandler was not a student. He had not been a student for years. Every credit he claimed to have earned, every transcript he had forwarded, and every interaction with the fictional advisor Omar Jolly was a fabrication. There were no lost credits in the system because there was no system for Chandler. He was a ghost in the academic records. By early afternoon, Bart knew the full scope of the betrayal. He realized that the SpaceX internship, the insurance job, and the career in renewable energy were not just exaggerations, they were non-existent. But as an accountant, Bart didn't explode in a fit of rage. He began documenting the collapse. He sent a text to Chandler at 1:13 p.m., informing him that he had spoken with the college and had a meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. that very afternoon to resolve the situation. He told his son that he needed to come along. He mentioned that the school had no record of the emails Chandler had been forwarding. The trap was set, and for the first time in his life, Chandler was out of digital options. The house on Rural Court became a pressure cooker of silence. Chandler replied to his father, claiming his phone was dead and that he was still feeling dizzy from his injury. It was a desperate, familiar stalling tactic. Bart was not moved. He told Chandler that they were going to the school together, regardless of his physical state. He was done being the supportive father to a phantom career. As the 2 p.m. deadline approached, Bart sat on the living room sofa, perhaps checking his watch, perhaps preparing the documents he intended to use to confront the admissions office. He was a man of order, sitting in a home he had worked his entire life to provide, unaware that his son was standing behind him with an SKS semi-automatic rifle. The first shot was not an accident. It was a mechanical solution to a logistical problem. The rifle barked in the quiet suburban living room, the sound muffled by the heavy Midwestern insulation of the house, but echoing with a definitive violence. The bullet struck Bart in the back. There was no struggle, no exchange of words, and no opportunity for the father to ask his son, why? Bart Halderson died on the sofa, surrounded by the very records that proved his son's life was a lie. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air, sharp, metallic, and completely foreign to the domestic scent of the house. Chandler didn't panic. The Eagle Scout took over. He realized that the body on the sofa was no longer his father. It was evidence. He dragged Bart's body into the basement, a space that would soon transform from a recreation room into a forensic laboratory. But the day was only half over. Krista was still at work. She was expecting to come home to a family preparing for Chandler's move to Florida, perhaps even a celebratory dinner for the SpaceX success. While he waited for his mother to return, Chandler began the process of erasure. He knew he couldn't hide a body in a suburban neighborhood forever. He began to utilize the tools available to him. He went to the garage and retrieved a hacksaw and various cutting tools. In the basement, away from the eyes of neighbors, he began to dismember his father. It was a grueling physical task that stood in stark contrast to the effortless digital lies he had told for years. The dizzy engineer was now a cold-blooded butcher, working with a precision that was as terrifying as it was methodical. Around 5 p.m., the garage door opened. Krista Halderson was home. She walked into a house that looked normal but felt wrong. We can only imagine the sensory assault she experienced, the faint lingering scent of cleaning chemicals, or perhaps the unnatural heat of the home. Chandler greeted her, likely still wearing the neck brace, playing the part of the injured son one last time. He told her that Bart was out, or that there had been a change in plans. But Krista was a mother. She knew the rhythm of her home. She likely noticed the blood that Chandler hadn't managed to scrub from the floorboards or the suspicious silence of her husband. She never made it to the phone. Chandler killed his mother shortly after she entered the house. He utilized the same cold efficiency he had used on Bart. Two parents, people who had spent 23 years nurturing him, were now reduced to logistical hurdles. The house on Rural Court was no longer a home. It was a crime scene of unimaginable scale. As night fell over Windsor, the neighbors noticed something unusual. The Haldersons' fireplace was roaring. It was a humid July evening in Wisconsin, with temperatures hovering in the 80s, yet thick. Dark smoke was billowing from the chimney. One neighbor would later recall that the smell was sickeningly sweet, heavy and cloying, unlike any wood-burning fire they had ever encountered. The thermal signature of the house was off the charts. Chandler was using the family hearth to incinerate the smaller remains of his parents, trying to turn their humanity into ash. The fireplace burned for hours, the intense heat cracking the masonry, a physical testament to the rage and desperation of a son whose lies had finally run out of room. He spent the rest of the night cleaning. He used gallons of hydrogen peroxide and bleach, scrubbing the basement stairs and the living room floor until the surfaces were chemically sterile. He moved with a focused energy, fueled by the adrenaline of a successful mission. He checked the security cameras he had installed, ensuring that his movements appeared normal to anyone watching from the outside. He was still the perfect son, just one who was currently burning his parents' heads in the living room. By the time the sun rose on July 2nd, the house was quiet again. Bart and Krista were gone, and Chandler was alone in a split-level tomb. He had deleted the people who knew the truth, but he hadn't yet figured out how to delete the physical evidence that remained. He had the SpaceX career he always wanted. He was finally untethered from reality, floating in a vacuum of his own making, waiting for the world to notice the silence from the house on Rural Court. The 4th of July weekend in Wisconsin is usually defined by the rhythmic crackle of fireworks and the heavy, sweet scent of charcoal grills. But for the residents of Rural Court in the summer of 2021, the holiday was marked by a different kind of atmosphere, one of stagnant, humid heat and a peculiar silence emanating from the Halderson residence. Chandler remained in the home, a solitary figure often seen on the porch or moving through the yard, with the measured, gingerly steps of a man still recovering from a catastrophic brain injury. He maintained the neck brace, a white plastic collar that served as a visual plea for patience and sympathy from anyone who dared to ask where Bart and Krista had gone. The narrative he provided was as simple as it was effective. He informed his older brother, Mitchell, and various neighbors that his parents had accepted an invitation to spend the holiday at their family cabin in White Lake. It was a plausible story, a much-needed getaway after the stress of Chandler's supposed SpaceX transition. However, the logistical details were intentionally blurred. He claimed they had hitched a ride with another couple, friends whose names he couldn't quite recall, people they had met through their social circles. To Mitchell, this was the first discordant note. His parents were meticulous planners who rarely left their own vehicles behind, yet both cars remained parked in the Windsor driveway, shimmering under the relentless July sun. Behind the closed doors of the split-level house, Chandler was orchestrating a digital seance. He possessed his parents' mobile devices, and for several days, he used them to mimic the pulse of a living family. He sent a text from Bart's phone to his own, and another to Mitchell, stating they had arrived at the cabin safely, though the signal was spotty and they might be hard to reach. It was a calculated move to buy time, to ensure that no one would go looking for them until the holiday weekend had concluded. While those messages traveled through the Wisconsin cellular towers, Chandler was engaged in the grueling physical labor of disposal. The digital engineer had to become a logistics manager of the macabre. The heat was an enemy. In the humid 80-degree weather, the biology of the basement was accelerating. Forensic evidence would later show that Chandler utilized the family's cleaning supplies with obsessive-compulsive frequency, yet the house began to take on a sterile chemical odor that couldn't quite mask the underlying reality. He needed to move the larger remains. On July 4th, while the rest of the country celebrated, Chandler drove his girlfriend's vehicle to a remote farm property in Roxbury, Wisconsin, a sprawling acreage owned by Catherine's family. He requested permission to visit, claiming he needed a quiet place to recover from his dizzy spells and perhaps enjoy the fresh air. Witnesses at the farm would later recall seeing the injured young man walking toward a wooded area near a ravine, carrying a heavy, bulging bag. He moved slowly, occasionally stopping to steady himself, playing the part of the concussed victim to perfection, even when no one was actively watching. In that ravine, amidst the dense Midwestern brush, he deposited what remained of Bart Halderson. He didn't bury the pieces, he simply discarded them, trusting the local wildlife and the passage of time to complete the erasure his fireplace had started. He returned to the farmhouse, appearing exhausted, a performance that earned him a glass of water and a place to rest from Catherine's unsuspecting relatives. By July 7th, the holiday grace period had expired. Mitchell's concern had transitioned into a quiet, cold panic. His parents hadn't returned, and their phones had finally gone dark. He pushed Chandler for more information, demanding the names of the friends they were with. Chandler's responses remained vague, a series of shrugs and, I don't knows, muffled by the medical brace. Finally, realizing the window of plausibility was closing, Chandler took the final step in his performance as the grieving son. He dialed the Dane County Sheriff's Office. He told the dispatcher his parents were missing. His voice on the recorded line was a study in controlled distress, flat, slightly breathless, the voice of a man who was struggling to process a tragedy. He explained that they had left on Friday and hadn't been heard from since. When a deputy arrived at the rural court home to take the initial report, Chandler greeted him with the same practiced fragility. He sat on the sofa where he had shot his father just 6 days prior, pointing to the empty cars in the driveway as evidence of his parents' sudden departure. He even showed the deputy the last texts he had received from Bart, digital breadcrumbs leading away from the house and toward the Northwoods. The community reaction was instantaneous. In Windsor, a town where the police blotter usually consisted of minor traffic violations or noise complaints, the disappearance of a prominent couple like the Haldersons was a seismic event. Missing person flyers began to appear on the windows of local businesses, grinning photos of Bart and Krista frozen in happier times. Social media groups were flooded with speculation. Was it a car accident? Had they been kidnapped by the mysterious couple? The local atmosphere shifted from festive holiday cheer to a heavy, suspicious dread. As the search intensified, Chandler became the focal point of the town's sympathy. Neighbors brought over casseroles and offered to mow the lawn, seeing only a disabled young man left alone in a big house, waiting for parents who might never come home. They didn't see the thermal damage to the fireplace. They didn't see the blood-soaked subflooring hidden beneath the basement carpet. And they certainly didn't see the vulture search Chandler had performed on his laptop just hours after the murders. A digital query asking how long it would take for scavengers to find a body in the Wisconsin woods. He was playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with the entire county. And for the first 48 hours, he was winning. But the detectives of the Dane County Sheriff's Office were not neighbors with casseroles. They were professional auditors of human behavior. They noticed that while Chandler was helpful, he was also curiously incurious. He didn't ask about cell tower pings. He didn't suggest places to search. He simply waited. And as they stood in the driveway on Rural Court, looking at 2 cars that hadn't moved an inch since July 1st, the investigators began to realize that the web of lies didn't lead to the cabin in White Lake. It began and ended right here, in the quiet shade of a suburban cul-de-sac. The investigators of the Dane County Sheriff's Office began their work by chasing ghosts, specifically the anonymous couple Chandler claimed had driven his parents to White Lake. They spent the first few days of the missing persons case reviewing highway traffic cameras and interviewing neighbors, looking for a vehicle that didn't exist. There were no sightings of a strange car at the Halderson residence on the morning of July 2nd, only the stagnant image of Bart and Krista's own vehicles sitting in the driveway, unused, silent. The initial frustration of the detectives was palpable as every lead Chandler provided dissolved upon inspection. The spotty cell service Chandler used to explain his parents' silence was debunked when tower pings placed Bart's phone nowhere near the Northwoods, but instead moving sporadically around the Madison area, closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. The pivot from a search and rescue mission to a homicide investigation occurred on July 8th, a humid Thursday that would strip away the last remnants of Chandler's Eagle Scout persona. The tip didn't come from a high-tech surveillance grid, but from the owners of the farm in Roxbury, the family of Chandler's girlfriend, Catherine. They informed detectives of Chandler's strange visit on July 4th, recalling how he had emerged from the woods looking exhausted and disheveled. When a specialized recovery team arrived at the property, they bypassed the farmhouse and headed straight for the dense brush near the ravine. There, among the tall grass and the buzzing of summer insects, they discovered a human torso. It had been discarded like refuse, partially obscured by the foliage, but unmistakably the remains of a man. While the medical examiner worked to confirm what the investigators already feared, that the torso belonged to Bart Halderson, Chandler was taken into custody. He wasn't charged with murder initially. He was arrested for providing false information in a kidnapping investigation. As he sat in the interview room, his demeanor remained eerily consistent with his previous performance. He continued to wear the medical neck brace, his voice a low, pained mumble as he maintained his story about the mystery couple. But as the concussed son sat in a jail cell, a forensic storm was gathering back at the house on Rural Court. The search of the Halderson home lasted for days. Crime scene technicians realized that the cleanliness of the house was a veneer, a chemical mask. Using luminol, a reagent that glows blue in the presence of blood, they illuminated the basement. The soft, ethereal glow revealed a spray of high-velocity impact on the walls and a heavy concentration of biological material on the concrete floor near the drain. The forensic team then turned their attention to the family hearth. They didn't just find ash, they found the mechanical remnants of a life. Sifting through the debris in the fireplace and the external ash trap, investigators recovered charred fragments of human bone, including a piece of a jaw and several teeth. The temperatures required to achieve this level of destruction suggested the fire had been fed with an accelerant and maintained for a grueling duration. The suburban living room had been used as a makeshift crematorium. The digital trail was even more damning. Forensics experts seized Chandler's laptop and mobile devices, peeling back the layers of the Omar Jolly persona. They found that every single email from the college advisor had been sent from an account created by Chandler himself, often while he was sitting in the same room as his father. The header information on the SpaceX acceptance letters showed they originated from the Halderson home's IP address. But the most chilling discovery was Chandler's Google search history from the days following the disappearance. On July 5th, while neighbors were bringing him food and offering their condolences, he had searched for "body found on Wisconsin farm" and "how long does it take for a body to decompose in water?" He had even looked up the flight patterns and feeding habits of vultures, a cold, analytical query into whether nature would help him hide his mother and father. On July 14th, the investigation moved to the Sauk City area, specifically to a stretch of land managed by the Department of Natural Resources. Based on GPS data from the vehicle Chandler had borrowed, detectives focused on a remote, wooded area. There, in a shallow, panicked attempt at concealment, they found the remains of Krista Halderson. Like Bart, she had been dismembered. The contrast between the digital world Chandler lived in, a world of aerospace engineering and high-level IT, and the visceral, primitive reality of what he had done to his mother's body was a psychological chasm that the investigators struggled to bridge. He had spent years pretending to build rockets and secure networks, only to end his story with a hacksaw in a Wisconsin forest. The community's reaction was one of profound collective betrayal. In Windsor, the Haldersons were the family everyone aspired to be, and Chandler was the son who had made it. The realization that the perfect neighbor was a dismembered remains in a ravine changed the local atmosphere overnight. The sympathy for the concussed son curdled into a sharp, pointed dread. People who had mowed the Haldersons' lawn or shared a beer with Bart now looked at their own children with a new, unspoken suspicion. The cul-de-sac on Rural Court became a landmark of horror, a place where a father's audit of his son's life had resulted in a death sentence. By the time the formal charges of first-degree intentional homicide were filed, the web of lies had been fully dismantled, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of the forensic evidence and the silent, empty house in Windsor. The trial in January 2022 served as the final audit of Chandler's artificial existence. Prosecutors transformed the courtroom into a digital crime scene, methodically dismantling the SpaceX facade with clinical precision. They presented the jury with the dual monitors from Chandler's bedroom, characterizing them as the primary instruments of a deception that had lasted for years. Forensic experts proved that every email from the fictional college advisor originated from Chandler's own devices, often sent while he sat mere feet from his father. The defense struggled to counter the sheer volume of physical evidence, specifically the charred bone fragments recovered from the family hearth and the blue luminol glow that illuminated the basement. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree intentional homicide and mutilating a corpse. During sentencing, the court addressed the hollow, narcissistic nature of his ambition, handing down a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The persona of the high-achieving engineer was permanently replaced by the reality of a maximum security inmate. The house on Rural Court eventually went to auction, its walls scrubbed of the chemical odors and blue forensic glow that once marked it as a tomb. For the people of Windsor, the split level remains a heavy landmark, a reminder that a son chose to incinerate his entire world rather than admit he had failed to master it. Chandler Halderson exists now in a space defined by concrete and iron, far from the Florida coastline he once described. He is a man who successfully deleted his past, only to find that the vacuum he created would be his home forever. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Imagine a woman so close to death that her breath is a wet rattle, her face shattered by the blunt force of a fireman's axe. She cannot speak. She can barely see through the swelling. But when a detective leans over the blood-soaked mattress and asks if her own son did this, she nods. Joan Porco didn't just survive a midnight execution, she delivered a silent testimony that would haunt the state of New York for decades. It was the ultimate paradox, a mother's final, involuntary act of truth against the child she would spend the rest of her life defending. A single nod that sealed a fate and started a nightmare. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Delmar, New York, sits on the southern edge of Albany, a town defined by its proximity to power and its distance from the chaos of the state capital. In 2004, it was a sanctuary of leafy streets and colonial-style homes, the kind of place where a low crime rate wasn't just a statistic, but a point of civic pride. At the center of this suburban idyll was 36 Broccoli Drive, a residence that, by all accounts, housed the quintessential American success story. Peter and Joan Porco were more than just neighbors. They were pillars of the community. Peter, 52, was a man of the law, a distinguished clerk for the New York State Supreme Court's Appellate Division. His reputation was one of meticulous precision and unwavering integrity, a man who navigated the complexities of legal precedent with a calm, intellectual grace. Joan, 54, complemented this gravity with a warmth that made her a beloved figure at the Glenmont Elementary School, where she worked as a children's librarian and speech therapist. Together, they curated a life that appeared seamless, rooted in the values of education, hard work, and familial loyalty. The Porcos had 2 sons who were the products of this environment. The eldest, Jonathan, had followed a traditional path of service, commissioning as an officer in the United States Navy. He represented the stability the Porcos valued, a clear, upward trajectory. Then there was Christopher, the younger son, who at 21 years old was a student at the University of Rochester. To the casual observer, Christopher was the charismatic charmer of the family. He possessed an easy, effortless social grace and a physical presence that suggested a young man comfortable in his own skin. He drove a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that became a recognizable totem in Delmar, and he dressed with a curated nonchalance that masked the financial strain required to maintain such an image. However, beneath the surface of the golden boy persona, a profound and pathological rot had begun to take hold. While Peter and Joan believed they were financing a prestigious education, they were actually subsidizing a sophisticated architecture of lies. Christopher wasn't just struggling academically, he was effectively a ghost on campus. He had been forced to withdraw from the university due to failing grades, yet he continued to reside in the dorms, pretending to attend lectures and sit for exams. The psychological disconnect was staggering. He spent his days maintaining a social life built on a foundation of total fabrication, convincing his peers and his parents that he was a high-achieving student on the verge of a bright future. The tension within the Porco household was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, pressurized buildup. Peter Porco, with his legal mind trained to spot inconsistencies, began to notice the frayed edges of Christopher's narrative. The financial discrepancies were the first cracks to appear. Peter discovered that his son had not only forged his academic transcripts to secure a return to university, but had also taken out a $31,000 loan in Peter's name, forging his father's signature as a co-signer. This wasn't merely a youthful indiscretion, it was a profound betrayal of the very legal and moral frameworks Peter lived by. In the months leading up to the incident, the atmosphere in the Broccoli Drive home shifted from one of quiet support to one of mounting confrontation. Peter's emails to Christopher became increasingly stern, stripped of parental softness. He expressed a sense of deep disappointment that bordered on desperation, informing his son that his deceptions had been unearthed and that the financial support was coming to an end. He warned Christopher that he would not be a party to his fraud, essentially giving the young man an ultimatum: come clean and face the consequences, or be cut off entirely. Christopher's reaction to this cornering was not remorse, but a further retreat into his own distorted reality. He began to view his parents not as benefactors, but as obstacles to the lifestyle he felt entitled to lead. The charismatic exterior remained intact for his friends in Rochester, but in the private sphere of his communications with Delmar, the mask was slipping. Joan, ever the maternal protector, tried to bridge the gap, pleading for honesty, while simultaneously fearing the fallout of Peter's looming judgment. The family was standing on a fault line, unaware that the son they had raised was no longer the person they saw in the family photographs, but a stranger capable of calculating the exact weight of a fireman's axe. The disintegration of Christopher Porco's golden boy persona did not occur in a singular, explosive moment of realization. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing erosion, a paper trail of deceit that Peter Porco, with his forensic legal mind, began to piece together throughout the spring and autumn of 2004. Christopher's life at the University of Rochester was an elaborate theatrical production, one where he played the role of a diligent student, while the reality was a void of failed credits and administrative dismissals. By the time the final semester of his sophomore year ended, the university had officially disenrolled him due to a lack of academic progress. But to Peter and Joan, Christopher was still their promising younger son, moving toward a degree in economics. He didn't just lie about his grades, he curated an alternate reality. He intercepted mail from the university, ensuring that the official notices of his expulsion never reached the Broccoli Drive mailbox. He spoke of professors who didn't exist and assignments he never submitted, maintaining a conversational rhythm that seemed entirely natural. The first significant crack in this facade appeared not in a transcript, but in a bank statement. Peter Porco discovered that his son had engaged in a calculated act of identity theft, one that hit at the very core of Peter's personal and professional honor. Christopher had applied for a $31,000 loan from Greenlink, a private lender, to finance his lifestyle and the upkeep of his prized yellow Jeep Wrangler. To secure the funds, he had forged Peter's signature as a co-signer. For a man who spent his days in the highest courts of the state, ensuring the integrity of the law, discovering that his own son was using his name to commit bank fraud was a profound humiliation. Peter did not react with an emotional outburst. He responded with the cold, precise language of a man who dealt in facts. The financial betrayals deepened with a secondary incident involving an eBay transaction. Christopher had attempted to sell a high-end laptop he did not possess, pocketing several $1,000s from an unsuspecting buyer. When the victim realized the scam and threatened legal action, the trail led directly back to the Porco residence. Peter was forced to step in, using his own funds to reimburse the victim to prevent a criminal record from tarnishing Christopher's future. In his communications with his son, Peter's tone shifted from paternal guidance to a weary, clinical observation of a personality he no longer recognized. He began to use a word that would later define the prosecution's case: pathological. In a series of increasingly grim emails sent in the weeks leading up to November 2004, Peter stripped away any remaining ambiguity. He told Christopher that his behavior was not merely a lapse in judgment, but a deep-seated character flaw. He expressed a sense of mourning for the son he thought he knew, noting that the web of lies had become so dense it was impossible to discern where the truth began. Peter gave him an ultimatum, a deadline that was rapidly approaching. He informed Christopher that he would no longer be financing his lifestyle, and more importantly, he would not be covering for his crimes. He demanded that Christopher meet with him in person to discuss how he intended to repay the forged loan. The message was clear: the bank of Peter and Joan Porco was closed, and the protection Peter provided was being withdrawn. Joan Porco's position in this burgeoning conflict was one of agonizing mediation. She was a woman defined by her empathy, a librarian and therapist who believed that any problem could be solved through dialogue and understanding. While Peter viewed the situation through a legalistic lens of fraud and consequence, Joan viewed it through the lens of a mother's hope. She was the buffer, the one who pleaded with Peter to give Christopher one more chance, and the one who sent Christopher gentle, pleading messages asking him to simply tell the truth so they could move forward. She couldn't fathom that her son's deceptions were anything more than a young man's fear of disappointment. She didn't see a predator, she saw a child who had lost his way. By early November, Christopher was effectively trapped. The University of Rochester was demanding proof of his re-enrollment status. His father was demanding the return of $31,000 he didn't have, and the social circle he had cultivated in Rochester was built on the premise that he was a wealthy, successful student. The Jeep Wrangler, the ultimate symbol of his fabricated status, was at risk of repossession. In his mind, Peter Porco had transformed from a father into a prosecutor, a man whose primary goal was to dismantle Christopher's life. The emails between them became a digital countdown. On November 4th, Peter sent a final stinging message, telling Christopher that he was a disgrace and that the time for excuses had passed. He warned him that if he showed up at the house for the upcoming Thanksgiving break without a concrete plan for restitution, he would be turned away. Christopher's responses to these salvos were masterpieces of gaslighting. He told his father that there had been a misunderstanding at the bank, that the school's administration had made a clerical error with his grades, that he was the victim of a series of unfortunate events. He maintained a veneer of calm, even as the walls closed in. He was a man who had become so comfortable in his lies that the truth felt like a foreign language he refused to learn. While he was telling his mother he loved her and missed her, he was likely calculating the exact moment when the voices of his parents would fall silent forever. The dynamic at 36 Broccoli Drive had become a pressure cooker of unspoken resentment and documented betrayal. Peter was prepared to exercise tough love, unaware that the love had already curdled into something lethal in his son's heart. The stage was set for a confrontation that Christopher knew he could not win through debate. To maintain the illusion he had built, he needed to eliminate the only two people who could see through it. He wasn't just planning a murder, he was planning a social reset. If his parents were gone, the debt, the fraud, and the disappointment would vanish with them. He would be the grieving son, the heir to the family's estate, and the master of his own narrative once again. In the quiet dorm rooms of Rochester, 140 miles away from Del Mar, the charismatic student began to visualize the weight of the axe in his hand. The late-night hours of November 14th, 2004, were marked by a bone-chilling dampness that clung to the asphalt of the New York State Thruway. At approximately 10:30 p.m., a signature splash of color moved through the darkness of the University of Rochester campus. Christopher Porco's yellow Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that would soon become one of the most scrutinized pieces of machinery in criminal history, pulled out of the dorm parking lot. The distance between the university and 36 Broccoli Drive was roughly 140 miles, a 3-hour journey that bridged the gap between a life of mounting failures and a desperate, violent solution. Christopher's transit was a study in calculated stealth, or at least the attempt of it. Forensic analysis of his movements that night would later center on the toll booths of the thruway. At 10:45 p.m., a yellow Jeep was captured by surveillance cameras passing through the Rochester toll plaza. The driver was a shadow behind the glass, but the vehicle was unmistakable, modified with oversized tires and a black soft top. The route was linear, slicing through the quiet heart of upstate New York. While his classmates were settling into the Sunday night rhythm of late-night study sessions and dorm room chatter, Christopher was hurtling toward a confrontation he had spent weeks mentally rehearsing. He arrived in Delmar in the deadest part of the night, likely between 1:45 and 2:15 a.m. The suburb was a graveyard of silent houses and parked sedans. He did not park in the driveway. He knew the sounds of the neighborhood too well to risk the metallic crunch of gravel or the heavy thud of a car door under the bedroom windows of his sleeping parents. He stayed on the periphery, slipping toward the house like a ghost, returning to a place it no longer belonged. The security system at 36 Broccoli Drive was a modern Sentinel, but it was one Christopher had helped maintain. At 2:14 a.m., the master code was punched into the keypad. It was the family code, a series of numbers that validated the entry as authorized. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered wood. The house simply opened its doors to the person it trusted most. Once inside, the first act of the intruder was to move toward the basement utility room. With a pair of heavy-duty snips, the telephone line was severed, an attempt to ensure that if the alarm was triggered, the monitoring station would be deaf to the emergency. Christopher moved through the familiar geometry of his childhood home. He knew where the floorboards groaned and where the shadows were deepest. In the garage, he found the instrument of his resolve, a heavy fireman's axe, a tool designed for destruction, for breaching barriers and breaking through deadlocks. He carried it up the stairs, the weight of the steel and wood balanced in a grip that had once held hockey sticks and textbooks. The master bedroom was bathed in the gray, filtered light of a suburban moon. Peter and Joan were deep in the heavy sleep of middle age, unaware that the air in their sanctuary had just grown colder. The attack was not a conversation. It was an industrial process of elimination. The axe was swung with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. It struck Peter first. The force was catastrophic, shattering the frontal bone of his skull and severing the nerves of his face. Then the blade turned to Joan. She was smaller, more fragile, but the violence visited upon her was just as absolute. The sounds were wet and heavy, the dull thud of steel hitting bone, the ragged intake of air that was no longer a breath but a reflex. Then silence returned to the room. Christopher left the axe on the bed, a signature of the carnage he believed he had completed. He exited the house, reset the alarm to create the illusion that the home had been secured from the inside, and began the 3-hour drive back to Rochester. He was back in his dorm room before the sun touched the horizon, logging into his computer to create a digital footprint, a timestamp of a man who had never left his desk. What followed at 36 Broccoli Drive was a physiological phenomenon that defies conventional medical logic. It is the core horror of the Porco case, the sleepwalking ghost. Peter Porco was not dead, but his brain had been functionally dismantled. The massive trauma to his frontal lobe had effectively performed a crude, violent lobotomy. However, the brainstem, the primal core that regulates basic motor functions and ingrained habits, remained active. In a state of profound neurological shock, Peter's body began to perform the automatic routines of a lifetime. He did not realize his skull was missing a significant portion of its structure. He did not realize the bed was a lake of his own blood. Driven by the sheer momentum of habit, Peter got out of bed. He walked to the bathroom. Evidence at the scene showed he stood before the mirror and attempted to shave. The sink was stained with the grisly mixture of shaving cream and brain matter. He then moved through the hallway, his steps heavy and stumbling, and navigated the stairs. He went into the kitchen. The man who had been executed in his sleep was now performing the chores of a Monday morning. He emptied the dishwasher. He prepared a pot of coffee. The most haunting detail discovered by investigators was Peter's final act of normalcy. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch to retrieve the morning newspaper. He then walked back inside, placed the paper on the kitchen table, and sat down. It was only then, as the blood loss finally overcame the electrical impulses of his brainstem, that the ghost finally collapsed. He fell to the kitchen floor, his life ending in the very spot where he had spent 1,000 quiet mornings. Joan remained upstairs, a shattered remnant of herself, clinging to a life that had been reduced to a single, pulsing thread of survival. The house was a temple of the macabre, a residence where the daily routine had been performed by a dying man who was already technically a corpse. The blood was everywhere, tracked from the bedroom to the bathroom, smeared on the kitchen cabinets, dripped onto the morning's headlines. As the town of Delmar began to wake up, the yellow Jeep was already back in its spot in Rochester. Christopher was appearing in the common areas of his dorm, yawning, complaining about the early hour, and acting the part of the weary student. He had committed the unthinkable, and then watched his father perform a post-mortem domestic routine, an echo of a life that Christopher had decided was no longer worth preserving. The incident was over, but the evidence of Peter's final, automated mourning would become the most powerful testament to the sheer brutality of his son's betrayal. Monday, November 15th, 2004, began with a conspicuous silence at the New York State Supreme Court's Appellate Division. Peter Porco was a man of absolute habit, a human metronome whose presence was as guaranteed as the morning gavel. When 10 a.m. passed without him at his desk, his colleagues felt a prickle of unease. By 11 a.m., that unease had curdled into alarm. Michael Axon, a court officer and friend, was dispatched to 36 Broccoli Drive to perform what everyone hoped was a redundant welfare check. The neighborhood was draped in the gray, mid-morning light of a typical November day. When Axon pulled into the driveway, he noticed Peter's car was still there. The house looked undisturbed, but the silence felt heavy, impenetrable. He walked to the front door and found it unlocked. This was the first anomaly. In Delmar, residents were comfortable, but Peter was a cautious man, a man who understood the mechanics of risk. Axon pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. The air inside was thick with a metallic copper scent, the unmistakable aroma of a massive volume of blood. He called out for Peter, his voice echoing through the still rooms. There was no answer. He moved toward the kitchen, his eyes scanning the floor. That was when the logic of the world shattered. Peter Porco lay on the kitchen floor near the entrance to the basement. The scene was a chaotic tableau of the mundane and the horrific. On the kitchen table sat the morning edition of the Albany Times-Union, neatly folded. Nearby, the dishwasher had been emptied. The coffee pot was out. Peter's body was a map of unimaginable trauma. His skull was open, the wounds so deep they were structural, yet he was dressed for a workday that would never happen. Axon didn't need to check for a pulse. The sheer volume of blood painted across the linoleum and the cabinets told the story of a man who had been dead long before he stopped moving. Axon drew his weapon, a reflex born of training, fearing the intruder might still be lurking in the shadows. He moved through the house, his boots sticking to the floor. As he ascended the stairs, the copper smell intensified, becoming a physical weight. The master bedroom door was ajar. Inside, the visual reality was worse than anything his mind could have conjured. Joan Porco was in the bed. She was a ruin of flesh and bone. The bedding was saturated, the white linens turned a deep, bruised crimson. Her face had been virtually erased by the axe. Her jaw was shattered, an eye was missing, and her forehead was a cavity of exposed tissue. Yet as Axon approached, he heard a sound, a jagged, wet wheeze. Joan was still alive. She was breathing through a throat filled with her own blood, a feat of biological defiance that seemed to defy every law of trauma medicine. The call for emergency services transformed the quiet suburb into a staging ground for a major forensic operation. Within minutes, the cul-de-sac was choked with ambulances, patrol cars, and the high-pitched hum of a medical helicopter circling overhead. Detectives from the Bethlehem Police Department, led by Christopher Bodish, flooded the residence. They were seasoned officers, but the sight of the bedroom and the trail of blood leading downstairs stilled their tongues. Bodish knew the clock was ticking against Joan's survival. While paramedics worked with frantic clinical desperation to stabilize her, he leaned over the bed. He didn't ask for a statement, he needed a designation. He asked Joan if she knew who had done this. He asked if it was a stranger. She remained still. He then asked a question that would define the next 2 years of legal warfare. Was it Christopher? In that moment, Joan Porco, a woman with half a skull and no capacity for speech, moved. She nodded her head. A single, deliberate vertical motion. Bodish, seeking absolute clarity, asked her again. Again, she nodded. He then asked if her older son, Jonathan, was responsible. Joan shook her head. No. The last nod was not just a gesture. It was a dying mother's identification of her own flesh and blood. As she was wheeled out on a gurney toward the waiting helicopter, the investigators had their prime suspect. The search of the property moved into a higher gear. In the master bedroom, the weapon was found exactly where the killer had left it, on the bed, nestled in the blood-soaked covers. It was a heavy, long-handled fireman's axe, its steel head matted with hair and biological matter. Forensic teams noted that the axe came from the family's own garage. This was an intimate execution. Outside, the perimeter search yielded more calculated details. The telephone lines at the side of the house had been cut with professional-grade snips. The alarm system had been deactivated using the family's secret code, then reactivated as the killer left. There was no evidence of a robbery. Jewelry sat untouched on the dresser. Peter's wallet remained in his pants. This was a targeted surgical strike aimed at the inhabitants, not their possessions. Rumors began to ripple through Delmar like a shockwave. Neighbors stood at their porch steps, watching the yellow tape go up. The news that Peter Porco, a man they saw every morning, had been found butchered, and that Joan was fighting for life, turned the neighborhood into a fortress of fear. The initial red herring of a professional hit, perhaps related to Peter's high-stakes work in the court system, was briefly debated among the press. But the police weren't looking at the mob. They were looking at the New York State Thruway. By the afternoon of November 15th, the search had expanded 140 miles to the west. While Joan Porco was undergoing the first of many reconstructive surgeries at Albany Medical Center, detectives were pulling into the parking lot of a dormitory at the University of Rochester. They were looking for a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler. They were looking for Christopher. The contrast was jarring. While the Broccoli Drive home was a charnel house, the dorm room was a sanctuary of normal collegiate life. When they found Christopher, he appeared stunned, the very picture of a grieving, confused son. But as the forensic sweep of the house in Delmar continued, a different search was happening, a search for a timeline. Investigators began pulling toll records and security tapes, looking for the yellow ghost that had moved through the night. They found it. At every major junction, the Jeep had been caught, a mechanical witness to a journey of 300 miles and a lifetime of betrayal. The search for the why began as the search for the how concluded. They had the weapon, they had the identification from the victim, and they had the trail. What they didn't have was the realization that the woman who had nodded Christopher toward a life sentence would soon become his most vocal advocate. The investigation into the carnage at 36 Broccoli Drive began with a profound sense of institutional betrayal. Because Peter Porco was a high-ranking official in the New York legal system, the initial instinct of the Bethlehem Police Department was to look outward, at the vengeful shadows of the courtroom. The red herring of a professional hit or a disgruntled litigant took hold of the early hours. Detectives combed through Peter's recent cases, looking for anyone with enough stored-up malice to cross the threshold of a private home with an axe. Rumors of organized crime involvement rippled through Albany, fueled by the sheer brutality of the scene. But the forensic reality quickly dismantled the mob hit narrative. A professional assassin does not use a family's own garden tool. They do not leave the weapon behind, and they certainly do not take the time to meticulously reset a residential alarm system. This was a crime of intimate geometry, an execution performed by someone who didn't just know the house, but belonged to it. The focus shifted from the courthouse to the Rochester dorm room with a speed that felt like whiplash to the Delmar community. While Joan Porco lay in a medically induced coma, a team of forensic accountants and digital investigators began dissecting Christopher's life. They found a man who had been living in the negative space of 100 different lies. The $31,000 loan was the cornerstone of the motive. investigators discovered that just weeks before the attack, Peter had sent a series of emails that were essentially legal briefs for a father-son divorce. He had told Christopher that his signature on the Greenlink loan was a forgery, and that he intended to notify the authorities if the matter wasn't rectified. In the cold language of the law, Christopher was looking at a felony charge initiated by his own father. To the police, the timeline was undeniable. Peter was killed not for what he did at the Supreme Court, but for what he was about to do at the kitchen table. The search for physical evidence proved to be an exercise in the absence of things. There were no fingerprints on the axe handle, no DNA from a struggle, no forced entry. To a seasoned detective, this didn't suggest a lack of a suspect, but rather a suspect with a profound understanding of forensic protocols. Christopher was a student of economics and a member of a high-achieving family. He understood the concept of cross-contamination. However, he had failed to account for the mechanical witnesses that defined the New York State Thruway. The investigation centered on the yellow ghost. Detectives began the grueling process of reviewing thousands of hours of surveillance footage from toll plazas between Rochester and Albany. They hit a breakthrough at the Rochester toll booth. At 10:45 p.m. on the night of the attack, a yellow Jeep Wrangler with a black soft top, a vehicle identical to Christopher's, was recorded entering the thruway. At the Albany exit, 3 hours later, the same vehicle was captured. The return trip was even more damning. At 5:12 a.m., a yellow Jeep was seen heading west, back toward Rochester. The driver had used the fast lane transponder, a device that Peter Porco had paid for, and which was registered to Christopher's Jeep. The digital breadcrumbs formed a straight line from the dorm room to the murder scene and back again. When detectives interrogated Christopher's roommates and fellow students, the charismatic facade began to crumble under the weight of specific time frames. Christopher claimed he had been in his dorm room all night, watching a movie and sleeping. But the university's network records told a different story. His computer, which was usually active deep into the night, had gone dark during the exact window of the drive to Delmar. There was no outgoing traffic, no keystrokes, no activity. He had tried to create a digital alibi by leaving his computer on, but the lack of interaction was a loud, echoing void. Furthermore, classmates recalled seeing the yellow Jeep missing from its usual spot in the parking lot during those critical hours. One student specifically remembered noticing the empty space because the Jeep was such a conspicuous fixture on campus. The psychological profile of the investigation began to paint Christopher as a master of compartmentalization. He had spent the morning after the attack appearing calm, even helpful. When the police finally brought him in for questioning, his demeanor remained eerily stoic. He spoke of his parents in the past tense before their deaths had even been officially confirmed to him. He expressed concern for his mother's condition, but his body language lacked the physiological markers of grief, the elevated heart rate, the dilated pupils, the involuntary tremors. He was a man performing the role of a grieving son, but the performance was too polished, too rehearsed. The community's reaction to these developments was a mixture of horror and a dark, voyeuristic fascination. Delmar was no longer a sanctuary, it was a fishbowl. The sight of the yellow Jeep, once a symbol of youthful energy, became an object of loathing. Parents looked at their own children with a new, unspoken anxiety. If a boy like Christopher Porco, raised with every advantage, loved by a woman as kind as Joan, could do this, then the concept of suburban safety was an illusion. Rumors began to circulate about Christopher's past, stories of small thefts and manipulative behaviors that had been dismissed as boys being boys, but now looked like the early symptoms of a sociopath. The investigation's most contentious pillar was the nod. As Joan Porco slowly emerged from the fog of trauma and multiple surgeries, the legal battle over her vertical head motion began. The defense team, led by high-profile attorneys, argued that Joan's nod was a result of extreme neurological shock and suggestibility. They claimed that Detective Bodish had led the witness, that a woman with a shattered brain could not possibly deliver a reliable identification. They brought in medical experts who testified that the trauma of an axe to the frontal lobe would render any cognitive response meaningless. But the investigators stood firm. They pointed to the fact that Joan had specifically shaken her head no when asked about her older son, Jonathan, She had demonstrated a capacity for discernment. The last nod became the emotional and legal epicenter of the case. As the months turned into a year, the frustration of the Bethlehem detectives grew. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but the lack of smoking gun DNA on the suspect himself was a hurdle. Christopher had been seen cleaning his Jeep with an intensity that suggested he was trying to scrub away the very molecules of the night. He had disposed of his clothing. He had maintained his innocence with a chilling, unwavering consistency. Yet the paper trail of the $31,000 forgery and the toll booth timestamps created a cage of facts that Christopher couldn't charm his way out of. The investigation concluded not with a confession, but with a realization that the primary victim had now become the primary defender. Joan Porco, despite the nod that had initially condemned her son, had spent her recovery period rewriting her own memory. She began to publicly support Christopher, appearing in court with her face still scarred and her eye covered by a patch, standing by the man the police were certain had tried to erase her from existence. The social echo in Delmar reached a fever pitch. Was this a mother's unconditional love, or was it the final, successful manipulation by a pathological son? The detectives had done their job. They had traced the axe and the Jeep. Now they had to convince a jury that a mother's first instinct was the truth, and her second was a tragedy. By 2006, the weight of the evidence forced the legal proceedings out of Albany to Orange County. A change of venue granted because Christopher's face and his yellow Jeep had become too toxic for a local jury pool. The trial in Goshen was a clinical dissection of a shattered family. Prosecutors presented the digital trail of the Greenlink loan and the throughway timestamps as a closed loop of guilt, while the defense fought a losing battle to have the last nod suppressed as hearsay. They argued that Joan's brain was too traumatized to be a reliable witness, but the prosecution countered with the surgical precision of the alarm deactivation. Christopher remained a study in eerie composure throughout the testimony, showing no visible emotion even when the autopsy photos of his father were displayed. The jury deliberated for 36 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on second-degree murder and attempted murder. During sentencing, the judge remarked that Christopher was a person of profound, calculated coldness, handing down a term of 50 years to life. The Golden Boy was finally unmasked, leaving the courtroom not as a student, but as a convicted matricide. The nod on that November morning was a reflex of the dying, but the life that followed was a masterpiece of denial. Joan Porco emerged from the hospital not as a star witness, but as a mother who had chosen to bury the truth alongside her husband. She stood on the courthouse steps, her face a map of the violence he inflicted, telling the world she loved the boy who shattered her life. Christopher Porco sits in a cell today, a man defined by a single vertical motion of his mother's head, a gesture she spent the rest of her days trying to take back. Love didn't just blind her, it became her final, silent sanctuary. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. In the digital realm, death is a temporary inconvenience. An avatar falls, a timer ticks, and life resets. But in a sweltering Central Florida apartment, a physical body does not respawn. In late 2024, a dispute over meaningless pixels and server latency violently bled into the physical world. A plastic keyboard snapped, followed by heavy, deafening silence. This was not a server crash. It was a fatal collision of online obsession and real-world rage, where the boundary between screen names and human empathy dissolved entirely, leaving one gamer permanently disconnected. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Central Florida is often characterized by its relentless, suffocating humidity and the blinding glare of the midday sun. But for 28-year-old Nicole Adamando, the climate outside her window was entirely irrelevant. She resided in a 900-square-foot apartment in a beige stucco complex that looked identical to 100 others scattered across the county. Heavy thermal blackout curtains remained perpetually drawn over her windows, sealing out the 95-degree heat and plunging her living space into a perpetual, artificial twilight. Her physical environment was merely a holding cell for her hardware. The true center of her universe sat on a sprawling desk dominating the living room, a high-end, liquid-cooled gaming rig that breathed a constant, low metallic hum into the chilled, recycled air. Nicole did not have a conventional career, nor did she measure her life in traditional milestones. Time was not tracked by daylight or seasons, but by server maintenance schedules, seasonal ranked brackets, and matchmaking queues. She was a fiercely competitive player in a brutally unforgiving tactical shooter, a game where a single error in judgment erased hours of grinding and plummeted a player's global ranking. Within this digital ecosystem, Nicole was a known entity. She possessed a cultivated, aggressive online persona. Behind the safety of a headset, she was dominant, vocal, and unapologetic. The digital realm provided her with the ultimate meritocracy. It did not matter that her bank account frequently hovered near zero, or that she routinely skipped meals to afford premium fiber optic internet. All that mattered was her reaction time and her placement on the leaderboard. She chased the chemical rush of a victory screen with the single-minded desperation of an addict. When she won, she was untouchable. When she lost, the visceral crash left her sitting in the neon glow of her dual monitors, with shaking hands and a racing pulse, entirely unable to separate simulated defeat from profound personal failure. This chronic online existence is notoriously solitary, yet it fosters an intense claustrophobic type of socialization. Enter Marcus. He was 29 years old, living just a few miles away in a similarly sun-bleached apartment complex. Functionally, Marcus was a mirror image of Nicole. He dedicated his waking life to the exact same competitive ladders, fueled by a terrible diet of cheap delivery food and heavy doses of caffeine. His physical space mirrored hers, towers of empty aluminum energy drink cans stacked precariously near expensive mechanical keyboards, the stale odor of fast food mingling with the dry heat of overworked power supplies. Marcus was not just another random avatar in a matchmaking lobby. He held a reputation in their shared community for a calculated, deeply arrogant playstyle. He was the type of competitor who did not simply want to secure a win. He wanted to mentally break his opponents in the process. Initially, he and Nicole existed in parallel, navigating the same high-stakes digital circles. To her, Marcus was not a human being with a history or a heartbeat. He was simply a barrier, a frustratingly competent obstacle blocking her ascent to the elite competitive tiers. Their dynamic began as a bitter rivalry. They frequently matched against one another, engaging in toxic, adrenaline-fueled exchanges over voice chat. Nicole studied his recorded gameplay clips, obsessing over his tactics, allowing a deep, festering resentment to build every time his screen name appeared above a digital corpse. But the matchmaking algorithm eventually forced a shift. It placed them on the same squad. Forced cooperation required communication outside of the chaotic game lobbies. They exchanged Discord tags, and their voice calls slowly drifted from strictly tactical callouts to personal conversations. They discovered the geographic anomaly of their proximity: two elite players residing in the same Florida county. Suddenly, the untouchable, arrogant rival felt dangerously real. The mutual respect that blossomed between them was not rooted in romance or traditional affection. It was a cold alliance of convenience. They realized that their distinct playstyles covered each other's blind spots. Together, they were a devastatingly effective duo, capable of climbing the ranks faster than they ever could alone. The physical toll of their lifestyle, the pale skin from vitamin D deficiency, the chronic wrist pain masked by compression braces, the bloodshot eyes, was entirely ignored in favor of their digital ascent. But an alliance built strictly on utility and shared obsession is inherently fragile. The lines between their digital partnership and physical reality began to blur. Realizing they were spending 14 hours a day in the same voice channel, they made a tactical, ultimately fatal decision. To minimize latency, eliminate the lag of separate internet connections, and halve their living expenses, they decided to consolidate their fortresses. They would drag their expensive rigs under one roof, moving the rivalry from the safety of the internet directly into a shared physical space. The logistics of combining their lives had absolutely nothing to do with domestic bliss. Moving in together was a calculated maneuver to optimize their networking environment. They secured a ground floor unit in the same beige complex, specifically chosen because it was situated physically closest to the internet service provider's regional routing node. Every foot of copper wire shaved vital milliseconds off their connection speed. That was the sole priority. Furniture was an afterthought. The living room was instantly converted into a command center, dominated by two massive L-shaped desks pushed back to back. Four 27-inch monitors formed a glowing, impenetrable wall between them. Thick bundles of Ethernet cables snaked across the cheap laminate flooring like black veins, connecting their custom-built towers directly to a commercial-grade router. Almost immediately, the physical environment of the apartment began to degrade. Two high-end gaming rigs, constantly running at maximum capacity, acted like industrial space heaters. The ambient temperature in the small living room frequently pushed past 82 degrees Fahrenheit, entirely overwhelming the struggling window air conditioning unit. To combat the glare on their screens, the thermal blackout curtains were nailed directly to the drywall, sealing off the Florida sun permanently. Time lost all meaning. Morning and night were dictated solely by server populations and matchmaking queues. They slept in shifts on a bare mattress pushed into the corner of the bedroom, usually crashing only when their eyes burned too intensely to focus or their hands began to cramp. At first, the merger yielded the exact digital dividends they had anticipated. Their coordination, unhindered by internet latency or the need to rely on push-to-talk microphones, was lethal. They could hear the physical clack of each other's keyboard strokes, anticipate movements, and execute strategies with terrifying precision. They climbed the competitive ladders at an unprecedented rate, leaving a trail of furious, defeated opponents in their wake. For a brief window of a few months, they were virtually untouchable. The shared adrenaline of a hard-fought victory served as a substitute for actual human connection. They celebrated not with physical affection, but by immediately queuing up for the next match, endlessly chasing the chemical high of digital supremacy. But the architecture of competitive gaming is designed to eventually force a plateau. The matchmaking algorithm adjusted to their elevated win rate, placing them into lobbies against professional tier players and highly coordinated teams. The easy victories evaporated. Matches became grueling, hour-long wars of attrition where a single missed shot or a fraction of a second delay meant total squad elimination. And with the heavy losses came the toxicity. The aggressive, belittling language they had previously reserved for random internet strangers slowly began to turn inward. Because they were sitting less than 3 feet apart, the protective barrier of the screen was removed, making the insults acutely personal. Following a devastating loss that dropped them out of the elite ranking tier, the post-match debriefings devolved into vicious interrogations. He accused her of poor spatial awareness, claiming her hesitations were actively sabotaging his flanking maneuvers. She retaliated, sharply pointing out that his aggressive pushes were reckless and mathematically unsound, leaving her entirely exposed to enemy fire. They communicated almost exclusively in gaming jargon, stripping away any remaining semblance of a normal relationship. They stopped using their given names, referring to each other strictly by their online handles, even when arguing over whose turn it was to take out the overflowing trash. Empathy was eradicated from the apartment. If one of them felt ill or complained of a migraine, it was not treated as a human ailment. It was treated as a severe inconvenience to the squad's grinding schedule. Weakness in the physical world translated directly to weakness on the server, and neither was willing to tolerate a drop in performance. This psychological deterioration was heavily compounded by severe financial strain. Maintaining a competitive edge in esports is an expensive addiction. When a new graphics card was released, boasting higher frame rates, it was purchased immediately, regardless of the bank balance. When a mouse switch began to double-click, it was replaced with a premium model that same afternoon. These hardware upgrades were deemed essential, non-negotiable expenses. Rent, electricity, and groceries were entirely secondary. By the fall, their accounts were constantly overdrawn. They survived on a diet consisting of cheap instant ramen, heavily processed delivery food, and cases of discount energy drinks ordered in bulk. The apartment began to smell faintly of heated ozone, stale sweat, and decaying cardboard. Late notices from the property management company were tossed unopened onto the kitchen counter. The only bill that was paid religiously, with terrifying punctuality, was the fiber optic internet connection. The isolation became absolute. They stopped responding to texts from family members. They ignored loud knocks on the front door. Their entire reality was confined to the illuminated rectangles in front of them. The stakes of the game had mutated dangerously. It was no longer about climbing a digital leaderboard for prestige. It was about validating their miserable, impoverished existence. If they were losing in the game, it meant that the squalor, the severe sleep deprivation, and the mounting debt were all for absolutely nothing. Every single match became a desperate, white-knuckle fight for psychological survival. The physical proximity that had initially made them a lethal duo now functioned as a pressure cooker. The constant, rapid-fire clacking of mechanical keyboards, once a comforting background hum, became a grating, anxiety-inducing trigger. The heavy, frustrated breathing of a partner through the thin foam of a headset felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. They were two highly stressed, malnourished individuals trapped in a dark, hot box, armed with nothing but deep resentment and a profound inability to separate virtual failure from personal ruin. He began to relentlessly mock her reaction times, noting aloud that she was slipping, that she was no longer fast enough to hold her own in the high-tier lobbies. She fired back that his massive ego was blinding him to his own tactical blunders, that he was the dead weight dragging her down. The arguments escalated from sharp critiques of gameplay to deeply personal attacks on character and intelligence. The tension in the apartment tightened like a coiled spring, vibrating with the latent energy of thousands of hours of suppressed digital rage, just waiting for a physical outlet. The line between the game and reality was completely erased. The avatar and the flesh were one and the same, and any threat to the digital ego was perceived as a direct threat to life itself. It was a Tuesday in late September when the fragile, insulated ecosystem inside the apartment finally collapsed. The central air conditioning unit for the stucco complex had failed 3 days prior, leaving the space baking in an ambient temperature of 92 degrees. The air inside the room was thick and unmoving. It carried the acidic scent of burnt dust radiating from overworked PC exhaust fans, layered heavily over the stale metallic tang of dozens of crushed energy drink cans. They were deep into a 42-hour unbroken marathon. The seasonal competitive ladder was locking its final rankings in less than 12 hours, and they were exactly one victory away from breaking into the elite Grandmaster tier. This was not a casual pursuit. To them, this singular digital achievement was the culmination of thousands of hours of obsessive grinding. It was the absolute pinnacle of their existence. Physiologically, they were running entirely on fumes and synthetic stimulants. Nicole's hands were shaking from severe caffeine toxicity, her knuckles wrapped in tight compression bandages to stave off the shooting pains of carpal tunnel syndrome. Marcus sat less than 3 feet to her left, his posture hunched, his eyes fixed on the center of his primary monitor with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. The physical world had completely receded from their minds. There was no Florida heat, no impending eviction notices, no failing human bodies. There was only the digital map, the crosshairs, and the enemy squad. The final decisive match loaded into the server. For the first 20 minutes, their coordination was a lethal display of pure muscle memory. They cleared the initial hot zones, accumulated premium digital gear, and successfully secured a highly defensible high ground position on the map. The victory was mathematically assured if they simply maintained their hold and let the enemy come to them. Nicole was positioned on the outer perimeter, holding a tight tactical angle on the only approach vector. Marcus was stationed above her in a digital watchtower, tasked with providing overwatch and calling out enemy movements. Then, the fatal miscalculation occurred. It was not a hardware failure. It was not a sudden latency spike from the regional routing node. It was a conscious, fundamentally greedy human decision. An extremely rare, high-value supply cache spawned on the digital map, located roughly 200 in-game meters outside of their fortified perimeter. Securing it meant abandoning the safety of the high ground and completely breaking their defensive formation. Marcus made the call without speaking a single word of warning over the headset. He abandoned his overwatch position, sprinting toward the supply cache, driven by an obsessive impulse to hoard the best digital weaponry for his own avatar. That single selfish rotation left Nicole's flank completely exposed. The opposing squad capitalized on the tactical error instantly. 3 enemy players breached the perimeter Marcus was supposed to be guarding. Nicole's primary monitor flashed violently red. Her character was eliminated in a fraction of a second, her screen instantly fading to a gray spectator view. Helpless, she watched through the camera feed as Marcus, now isolated and heavily outgunned in an open digital field, was systematically dismantled by the enemy team. The stark, humiliating graphic of defeat plastered itself across their monitors. The point deduction registered immediately, dragging their shared ranking down into the abyss. The 42 hours of physical suffering, the severe sleep deprivation, the aching joints, all of it was instantly rendered worthless by a single moment of absolute greed. The transition from the digital server back to the sweltering physical apartment was a violent shock to the nervous system. Nicole ripped her heavy noise-canceling headset off, slamming it onto the edge of the laminate desk. The sudden absence of simulated gunfire left a ringing, heavy silence in the room, underscored only by the frantic, high-pitched whining of the cooling fans. She turned her chair, the wheels catching roughly on the cables below. She demanded an explanation. She demanded to know why he broke the formation and abandoned the point. Marcus did not apologize. He deflected the error entirely. He leaned back in his mesh gaming chair, his pale face illuminated by the harsh blue light of his screen, and coldly stated that her reaction time was simply too slow to survive a basic perimeter breach. He shifted the entirety of the blame onto her mechanical skill, completely ignoring his own catastrophic tactical abandonment. He insulted her aiming precision. He noted with calculated cruelty that he was exhausted from carrying her dead weight through the competitive brackets. The psychological tension in the stifling room snapped like a dried tendon. It was a physical rupture. Nicole stood up. Her legs were severely cramped from sitting immobile for a day and a half, but a sudden, blinding rush of adrenaline completely overrode the fatigue. She reached across the narrow divide between their desks and swept her arm outward in a wide, violent arc. Dozens of empty cans, dirty porcelain plates, and a secondary monitor crashed onto the floor. The sound of shattering plastic and tearing copper cables filled the small space. Marcus stood up to meet her, his own rage finally boiling over into the physical realm. He was taller, broader, but his reflexes were heavily dulled by days of exhaustion. He pushed her back, hard. She stumbled backward, her spine catching the sharp wooden corner of her own desk. The pain registered in her brain as a blinding flash of white light. The digital argument was officially over. This was a physical war for survival inside a 90-degree box. Nicole's right hand scrambled blindly across the cluttered surface of her workstation, desperately searching for anything to use as leverage or defense. Her fingers closed tightly around the base of a heavy, solid steel microphone boom arm. It was a dense, industrial piece of hardware, clamped tightly to the edge of the wood. With a desperate, feral yank, she twisted the metal arm backward, loudly snapping the thick plastic mounting bracket. The heavy steel rod came free in her grip. Marcus lunged forward, shouting something unintelligible about the ruined monitor on the floor. Nicole swung the steel pipe. It was a short, devastating, uncalculated arc. The heavy metal connected directly with the side of his skull, just above the left ear. The physical impact produced a sickening, wet crack, a deeply organic sound entirely alien to the synthesized digital audio they were so intimately accustomed to. Marcus did not stagger. He dropped instantly. His body collapsed heavily against the desks, his dead weight pulling a tangled mass of thick black power cords down with him. He hit the cheap laminate flooring with a heavy, final thud. Silence returned to the room. It was absolute and suffocating. The frantic clicking of mechanical keyboards was permanently gone. The toxic verbal exchanges were extinguished. There was only the ragged, uneven intake of oxygen as Nicole stood over him. The heavy steel microphone arm slipped slowly from her sweaty grip, clattering loudly against the floorboards. She waited for him to get up. In their insulated world, damage was a temporary state. a health bar replenished over time. A teammate could initiate a digital revival protocol, but the physical world offered no such forgiving mechanics. Marcus remained perfectly motionless. A dark, rapidly expanding pool of blood began to seep from his hairline, staining the pale laminate flooring. The thick liquid caught the shifting, pulsating RGB lighting emanating from the glass side panels of their massive PC towers. Vivid red, neon blue, toxic green, reflecting off the pooling blood in a slow, hypnotic rhythmic cycle. Nicole backed away, her breathing shallow and erratic. She stared at her trembling hands, now coated in a fine layer of sweat and dirt. She looked back toward the main monitor. The matchmaking lobby was still open. A small digital timer ticked down in the corner of the screen, silently counting the seconds until the server would automatically cue them for the next match. The game was ready to continue. The digital ecosystem remained entirely indifferent to the permanent deletion of a human life that had just occurred in the shadows beneath the desk. The matchmaking timer hit 0. A loud synthetic brass horn signaled the start of a new round. On Nicole's primary screen, her avatar dropped seamlessly into the digital battleground. Beside her in the simulated world, Marcus's character materialized and stood perfectly still. He was idle at the spawn point. She watched through her monitor as an enemy sniper eventually located his motionless avatar, executing him with a single shot. It was a clean, instant digital death. Less than 3 feet to her left, the physical reality was messy, permanent, and rapidly cooling on the cheap laminate floor. The violent rush of adrenaline completely evaporated, leaving behind a crushing wave of nausea. The ambient temperature in the apartment was still locked at a suffocating 92 degrees. Nicole could not simply log off. She could not hit a reset button to undo the strike. She had to manage 180 pounds of dead weight. She grabbed him by the shoulders, her sneakers slipping on the slick, wet surface. It was a grueling, agonizing exertion that her atrophied muscles were entirely unprepared for. She dragged him down the short corridor and maneuvered him into the narrow hallway closet, shoving him violently into the dark corner. She piled empty cardboard graphics card boxes, tangled webs of spare Ethernet cables, and heavy winter coats over the body, until the shape was thoroughly obscured. She scrubbed the floorboards with cheap bath towels and industrial bleach, tossing the ruined rags into thick black trash bags. But cleaning the physical crime scene was only a fraction of the problem. In their ecosystem, physical absence was entirely irrelevant. Digital absence, however, triggered immediate alarms. Before the floor was even fully dry, the notifications began. The sharp, repetitive chiming of Discord alerts echoed through the sweltering living room. Their squad mates were pinging his handle, demanding to know why he had abandoned the previous match and why his microphone was suddenly muted. Nicole wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans, moved to Marcus's mesh gaming chair, and pulled his mechanical keyboard toward her. She did not just take over his accounts, she hijacked his entire digital identity. She typed a response to the group server, carefully mimicking his precise cadence. She used all lowercase letters, stripped away the punctuation, and injected his signature abrasive tone. She explained that a spilled energy drink had completely fried his motherboard and shorted out his headset wiring. She wrote that he was furious, completely broke, and would be offline until he could scrape together the cash for replacement parts. The squad accepted the excuse without a single follow-up question. The illusion held perfectly. For the next 12 days, Marcus lived exclusively inside a fiber optic cable. Nicole managed his ghost with the obsessive micromanagement of a professional dispatcher. She kept his computer running alongside hers. Every few hours, she reached over and wiggled his mouse to ensure his status indicator remained a vibrant, active green. She occasionally queued his account into casual, low-stakes public lobbies, moving his avatar just enough to avoid the server's automated inactivity penalties. When his mother sent a text message asking why he had missed a scheduled Sunday phone call, Nicole replied directly from his unlocked device. She tapped out a short, irritated response, claiming he had picked up a grueling third shift at a local warehouse to pay off his mounting credit card debt. She instructed his family not to bother calling because his phone would be powered down while he slept during the day. They believed the text. No one demanded to hear his voice. As long as the data packets kept transmitting, society assumed he was alive. But the facade, no matter how flawlessly executed online, could not pause the relentless progression of biology. The broken air conditioning unit proved to be the fatal flaw in the cover-up. The stagnant, oppressive Florida heat acted as an extreme accelerant. By the end of the first week, the odor began to manifest. It started as a dense, sickly sweet heaviness that clung to the thermal blackout curtains and seeped deep into the upholstery of the gaming chairs. Nicole tried desperately to mask it, burning cheap pine-scented candles and spraying aerosol air fresheners directly into the closet. But the rot was absolute. Soon, the smell grew sharp and gag-inducing, bleeding through the thin drywall and slipping beneath the rubber weather seal of the front door. The physical world was finally encroaching on her insulated bunker. The neighbors in the stucco complex did not know Marcus was missing. They rarely saw the couple and never interacted with them in the breezeway, but they could not ignore the stench polluting the shared outdoor corridor. The complaints bypassed law enforcement entirely and went straight to the property management office. On the 13th day, a heavy knock rattled the front door. Nicole froze, her hands hovering rigidly above her keyboard. She did not answer. A moment later, the distinct sound of paper sliding under the doorframe broke the silence. It was an official notice. Management was responding to multiple severe odor complaints. A mandatory maintenance inspection was scheduled for the following afternoon to investigate and repair the broken HVAC system. Nicole stared at the bright green status dot next to Marcus's name on her secondary monitor. She had successfully kept him alive on the internet, but the physical decay was about to shatter the servers. The digital ghost was facing a real-world eviction. The maintenance worker arrived precisely at 2 p.m. on a sweltering Thursday. He did not need a master key to enter. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar, as if the occupant had fled in a blind panic mere moments before. Pushing the heavy door inward, he was immediately struck by a physical wall of putrid, superheated air. The 92-degree ambient temperature had accelerated the biological processes of decay to a terrifying, unbearable degree. He never made it to the broken HVAC unit in the ceiling. His flashlight beam caught a massive swarm of flies congregating around the sealed seam of the hallway closet. He stepped backward into the breezeway, pulled his radio from his belt, and breathlessly notified local law enforcement. When the first responding officers breached the apartment, they found a bizarre, highly disturbing juxtaposition of life and death. In the center of the stifling room, two massive gaming computers still hummed loudly, their liquid cooling systems struggling against the oppressive heat. Glass panels radiating toxic neon light into the gloom. Less than 10 feet away, hidden beneath a mountain of empty cardboard hardware boxes and tangled Ethernet wires, lay the heavily decomposed remains of a 29-year-old man. The crude attempt at sanitation was painfully obvious to the naked eye. The cheap laminate flooring near the desks was warped and bleached white, reeking of industrial cleaning chemicals that failed entirely to mask the underlying metallic odor of iron and decay. Nicole was not inside the apartment. She was located 3 hours later, sitting entirely alone at a plastic table inside a 24-hour internet cafe located 2 miles down the highway, staring blankly at a muted monitor. When brought into the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, she presented a carefully constructed facade of hysterical grief. She completely denied any involvement in the physical violence, spinning a complex, highly technical web of digital misdirection. She told investigators that Marcus had been embroiled in a high-stakes, illicit online gambling syndicate tied to overseas competitive matches. According to her narrative, he had purposefully thrown a tournament, costing a dangerous faction of international hackers a massive sum of cryptocurrency. She claimed he had been receiving hyper-specific death threats and had fled the apartment in the middle of the night, leaving his expensive equipment behind out of sheer terror. The body in the closet, she suggested with wide-eyed panic, must have been the work of an organized hit squad, a real-world swatting attempt that escalated into a physical execution. To bolster her claim, she provided detectives with a USB drive containing heavily doctored screenshots of encrypted chats, showing anonymous users threatening to leak Marcus's physical address. For the first 4 days of the investigation, this digital red herring consumed law enforcement entirely. Detectives unaccustomed to the obscure, highly toxic mechanics of competitive esports were forced to navigate a labyrinth of VPNs, temporary Discord servers, and anonymous gamer tags. Cybercrime units spent hundreds of exhausting hours parsing through months of aggressive voice logs, tracking IP addresses that bounced from Central Florida to routing servers in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. They interviewed teenagers in Ohio and bewildered college students in California, desperately trying to verify the existence of the Phantom Syndicate Nicole had meticulously described. The community surrounding the game erupted into a toxic frenzy of rumors. Dedicated forum threads filled with tens of thousands of speculative posts, turning the tragedy into a viral piece of online entertainment before the victim had even been officially identified by the medical examiner. The digital noise was absolutely deafening, creating a massive bottleneck of useless leads and dead ends. But the vast, untraceable nature of the internet is ultimately anchored by physical reality. While the cyber analysts chased ghosts across the globe, the forensics team remained inside the suffocating box of the Florida apartment, dismantling the crime scene piece by piece. The environment was a nightmare for the crime scene technicians. Forced to wear heavy, unventilated Tyvek suits in a room that still hovered above 90 degrees, they documented the tragic squalor of the couple's existence before tearing up the floorboards. The bleach she had poured so frantically had only sterilized the uppermost surface. When technicians pried up the warped laminate planks beneath the dual gaming desks, they discovered a massive, undisturbed pool of dried blood that had soaked deep into the porous subflooring. The resulting spatter pattern, cast against the lower drywall and the tangled webs of PC cables, indicated a violent, downward strike from a standing position, completely contradicting Nicole's theory of a chaotic home invasion. A professional hit squad does not bludgeon a target with a heavy desk accessory and then, haphazardly, bury the victim under winter coats and empty graphics card boxes. The medical examiner's report confirmed the forensic narrative. The victim had suffered massive blunt force trauma to the left temporal lobe, caused by a heavy cylindrical steel object. A coordinated search of the apartment complex's industrial dumpsters yielded the missing piece of the puzzle. Buried beneath layers of rotting food waste and household trash, investigators recovered a dense steel microphone boom arm. The thick plastic mounting bracket had been violently snapped off, and despite a hasty wipe down, microscopic traces of human tissue and bone fragment remained lodged deep within the metal threading. The final, devastating blow to Nicole's carefully constructed illusion came from the very technology she worshipped. The cyber unit abandoned their global search and focused their efforts strictly on the local router recovered from the apartment. They extracted the detailed network logs from the exact window of time Marcus had supposedly been sending messages to his squadmates. The data was irrefutable. The messages assuring his online friends that he was alive, broke, and looking for replacement hardware had indeed originated from his authenticated account. However, the router logs proved that the device transmitting those messages was physically connected to the exact same local network switch as Nicole's active computer. The digital packets had not traveled from a warehouse across town, nor from an international hacker's terminal. They had been transmitted from a distance of less than 3 feet apart. Detectives returned to the freezing interrogation room, carrying a thick binder of forensic and digital evidence. They laid out the photographs of the blood-soaked subfloor, the recovered steel microphone arm, and the stark, undeniable router logs. They methodically dismantled her Phantom Hit Squad narrative, explaining exactly how her desperate attempt to maintain his digital ghost had provided the very timestamps needed to secure her conviction. Faced with the inescapable reality of the physical evidence, the psychological armor Nicole had worn for years completely shattered. She was no longer a dominant, untouchable avatar operating behind a shield of anonymity. She was a 28-year-old woman shivering under harsh lights, realizing with crushing finality that there was no server rollback, no alternate account, and no escape from the permanent consequences of her physical rage. The formal arrest was devoid of any cinematic flair. There were no flashing screens or dramatic respawn timers, just the cold, heavy click of steel handcuffs echoing against the cinderblock walls of the precinct. During the trial, the contrast between her dual identities became glaringly obvious. The fierce, untouchable digital warlord who ruthlessly commanded online lobbies, was completely gone. In her place sat a pale, visibly trembling defendant, shrinking under the harsh fluorescent lights of the county courthouse. Her defense attorney attempted to pivot the narrative away from a deliberate strike. He built an argument centered on severe sleep deprivation, extreme caffeine psychosis, and a tragic accident resulting from a mutual physical altercation. He claimed the lethal blunt force trauma occurred when the victim lost his footing and fell violently against the sharp edge of the heavy wooden desk. The prosecution easily dismantled this theory using her own meticulous cover-up. They focused entirely on the digital breadcrumbs, the hijacked Discord account, the fabricated text messages to his mother, and the bleach-soaked subflooring. This was not the panicked behavior of someone who had witnessed an accident. It was the calculated, deeply methodical work of a player trying to erase a fatal error and manipulate the server logs. It took the jury less than 4 hours to deliberate. The verdict was delivered with crushing finality, guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. The judge's sentence ensured she would spend the next 4 decades in an 8 by 10 foot concrete cell, stripped of her hardware, permanently disconnected. In the glowing lobbies of the tactical shooter they once dominated, absolutely nothing changed. The seasonal rankings reset. The servers continued their relentless hum, completely indifferent to the permanent deletion of 2 local accounts. Marcus now rests beneath the suffocating Florida soil, while Nicole sits isolated in a concrete box, permanently stripped of her keyboard, her headset, and her fabricated supremacy. They sacrificed their physical humanity for a digital crown, but the system simply queued up the next match without them, an inescapable final game over. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. In the pristine, gated community of Abacoa, Florida, Timothy Ferriter's garage contained a secret that shattered the suburban illusion. Behind the standard overhead door stood an 8 by 8 foot windowless structure, a custom-built box of drywall and plywood. It wasn't a workshop or a storage unit. It was a cage. Inside, a 14-year-old boy was discarded for 18 hours a day, left with only a mattress and a bucket. The door didn't have a handle on the inside, only a deadbolt accessible from the garage floor. This was a dungeon in $1 million home. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Timothy Ferriter was a man who understood the architecture of success and the importance of maintaining its exterior. As a high-level executive in the technology and software industry, his professional life was a series of managed expectations and calculated results. Those who moved in his corporate circles saw a polished, capable leader, a man who had climbed the ladder to command 6-figure salaries and the respect of his peers. His wife, Tracy, complemented this image perfectly. She was a stay-at-home mother who appeared deeply invested in the complex logistics of raising 4 children, navigating the demands of a high-status household with practiced ease. The family's journey to the palm-lined streets of Jupiter, Florida, began thousands of miles away in Arizona. For years, they lived in the desert suburbs, building a life that looked, from every angle, like the American dream realized. It was during these years that the Ferriters decided to expand their family through adoption. In the early 2000s, they traveled to Vietnam to adopt a 1-year-old boy, the child who would eventually be known in court documents as RF. At the time, the act was framed as one of profound compassion, a wealthy American couple providing a future for an orphaned child from the other side of the world. However, the transition from the orphanage to the Ferriter household was not the seamless fairy tale the couple had anticipated. Almost immediately, Timothy and Tracy began to report significant behavioral issues with their new son. They described a child who was not just difficult, but fundamentally detached. Medical professionals eventually provided a diagnosis that would become the cornerstone of the Ferriters' future defense: reactive attachment disorder, or RAD. It is a condition often found in children who have experienced early childhood trauma or neglect. leaving them unable to form healthy emotional bonds with primary caregivers. In the Ferreter household, the diagnosis of RAD was treated not just as a medical reality, but as a looming threat. Timothy and Tracy claimed that as the boy grew into his teenage years, his behavior escalated from simple defiance to genuine danger. They told therapists and school officials about a son who stole, who lied with pathological conviction, and who allegedly exhibited violent tendencies toward his siblings. Timothy would later insist to investigators that they were living in a state of constant siege, fearful of what the boy might do if left to his own devices. Yet, as the years passed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge in how the parents addressed these challenges. In Arizona, the discipline was already beginning to look less like parenting and more like containment. The couple's other 3 biological children were raised in a world of privilege and freedom, while the adopted son was increasingly sidelined, his life dictated by a rigid set of rules that seemed to shrink his world with every passing month. In late 2021, Timothy accepted a new professional opportunity that required a move to Florida. They chose the Abacoa neighborhood in Jupiter, a community famous for its new urbanism design, where front porches and walking trails were meant to foster a sense of togetherness. They purchased a $1.1 million home on South Community Drive. It was a sprawling, beautiful property that promised a fresh start for the entire family. But the fresh start included a very specific construction project. Almost as soon as they moved in, Timothy began work in the garage. He didn't build a guest suite or a home gym. Instead, he utilized his professional skills in project management to oversee the installation of a small, windowless room. He told the contractors it was intended as a home office, or a quiet space, for his son's behavioral therapy. To the neighbors, the Ferreters were just another successful family, unloading moving trucks and settling into the rhythms of Jupiter life. They saw Timothy jogging in the mornings and Tracy running errands. They saw a family that seemed to have everything under control. They had no way of knowing that inside the pristine white garage of that $1 million home, a 14-year-old boy was being introduced to his new reality, a cell that measured exactly 8 feet by 8 feet. The why behind this construction was framed by Timothy as a desperate attempt to protect his family from a broken child. The how, however, would soon become the subject of a criminal investigation that would expose the dark rot beneath the Ferreters' polished suburban surface. The partnership between Timothy and Tracy Ferreter was not merely a marriage, it was a high-functioning logistical operation. They had met decades earlier, 2 ambitious individuals drawn together by a shared vision of an orderly, prosperous life. Their early years were defined by a relentless climb up the corporate and social ladders of the American West. Friends from their time in Arizona remembered a couple that seemed perfectly synchronized, rarely disagreeing in public and presenting a unified front that bordered on the impenetrable. They were a team that approached life's challenges with the clinical efficiency of a board meeting. When they decided to adopt RF, it was a project they undertook with the same calculated intensity they applied to Timothy's career. They didn't just want a child, they wanted to build a legacy of compassion that matched their financial success. But when the reality of raising a child with complex trauma began to chafe against their desire for a controlled environment, their relationship didn't fracture. Instead, it hardened. They closed ranks, and the boy was quickly redefined as a problem to be solved, an outlier in their otherwise perfect dataset. Their shared mindset was one of extreme isolation. Inside the walls of their home, Timothy and Tracy cultivated a dynamic where they were the primary victims of their son's existence. They spent hours behind closed doors, reinforcing each other's frustrations and validating a growing resentment. To the outside world, Tracy was the tirelessly devoted mother navigating the labyrinth of special education and behavioral therapy. To Timothy, she was the frontline commander reporting the boy's daily infractions. This feedback loop created a toxic domestic culture where the adopted son was increasingly viewed not as a family member, but as a hostile entity within the perimeter. The relationship between the parents and their biological children was equally complex. The 3 siblings were raised in an atmosphere of relative freedom, yet they were implicitly taught that their brother was different. that he was dangerous and required special measures. This created a profound psychological rift in the household. The biological children occupied the light of the family's public-facing life, while RF was being pushed into the shadows of the garage. Timothy and Tracy's complicity in this segregation was absolute. There was no room for dissent or empathy that might disrupt their established narrative of containment. As they moved into the house in Jupiter, the logistics of their parenting took a sinister architectural turn. Timothy, with his executive penchant for permanent solutions, viewed the garage as the only viable site for the office he intended to build. The planning was meticulous. He didn't just throw up a few sheets of drywall. He designed a space intended to endure. He and Tracy discussed the placement of the structure to ensure it was tucked away from the sightlines of anyone passing by the open garage door. They settled on a corner where the hum of the pool pump and the heavy, humid air of the Florida climate would provide a constant, droning backdrop. The construction phase was a period of quiet, shared purpose. Timothy oversaw the installation of the plywood floor and the ceiling, ensuring the space was entirely enclosed. The sensory details of this period are chilling. The sharp, chemical scent of fresh drywall mud, the rhythmic thud of a nail gun, and the sight of Timothy installing a camera in the corner of the ceiling. It wasn't just a room, it was a monitored environment. Tracy was present for the decisions regarding the furnishings, a single mattress on the floor and a plastic bucket. They didn't buy a desk or a bookshelf for this office. They were building a space that offered nothing but the barest requirements for biological survival. The most telling detail of their relationship was the lock. Timothy installed a deadbolt on the exterior of the door. It was a clear, mechanical statement of their shared philosophy. The boy had no agency, no way to exit, and no voice that could penetrate the thick layers of drywall. They had created a world where the only interaction the boy had with his parents was through a lens or a locked door. The relationship was no longer one of guidance or love. It had become one of jailer and inmate. Even as the box was completed, the Ferreters continued to participate in the social rituals of Abacoa. They hosted small gatherings and maintained their standing in the community, all while the 14-year-old was locked just a few feet away from their luxury SUVs. They relied on a shared silence, a mutual agreement that the horror in the garage was a medical necessity that no one else needed to understand. This wasn't a case of one parent hiding abuse from the other. This was a joint venture in cruelty, sustained by a couple who believed their wealth and their diagnosis of the child gave them the right to play the roles of judge, jury, and warden in their own home. Their partnership had evolved into a fortress, designed to keep the boy in and the truth out. The climate of Jupiter in January is deceptively pleasant, 75 degrees with a soft breeze coming off the Atlantic. But inside the garage on South Community Drive, the air remained stagnant and heavy. By the morning of January 28, 2022, the 14-year-old boy's reality had been reduced to a sequence of mechanical sounds. The most significant was the metallic clack of the deadbolt. This sound governed his entire existence. It was the only signal that the world outside his 8x8-foot enclosure was acknowledging his presence. For months, the boy's routine had been a study in extreme isolation, a protocol designed by Timothy Ferreter with executive precision. The boy would be released from the box only for school and the briefest of intervals for hygiene. His meals were not shared at the family table in the dining room just a few yards away. Instead, they were handed through the door. Often, he was forced to eat alone in the dim light of a single bulb, which was controlled by a switch on the outside of the structure. If Timothy or Tracy decided he had been defiant, the light stayed off. He would sit in total darkness, the only sound being the distant hum of the family's luxury cars or the muffled laughter of his siblings in the main house. The interior of the box was a sensory desert. There were no windows, no books, no toys, no items that suggested a child lived there. The walls were bare drywall, the floor a cold slab of plywood. In the corner sat a single mattress and a blue plastic bucket. This bucket served as his toilet. Because he was locked in for up to 18 hours a day, he had no access to the home's bathrooms. The smell of waste and stale air became a permanent fixture of his environment. a psychological weight intended to remind him of his otherness within the family unit. Timothy had installed a ring camera in the upper corner of the ceiling, a digital eye that allowed the parents to monitor the boy's every movement from their smartphones. This was not for safety, but for total surveillance. Later, investigators would recover over 1,700 hours of footage from this camera, a digital archive of suburban torture. The videos captured a disturbing power dynamic. Timothy was seen entering the box not to comfort, but to dominate. On multiple occasions, the footage showed Timothy pinning the boy against the plywood floor, his weight used to suppress a child who was significantly smaller and undernourished. The father's movements were clinical, his face often a mask of frustration as he lectured the boy about his Vietnam origins and his supposed lack of gratitude. Tracy's presence on the footage was equally chilling. She was seen standing in the doorway, her voice sharp as she listed the boy's failures. The psychological pressure was constant. They told him he was broken, that his brain didn't work like other people's, and that the cage was the only place he belonged. The why behind this treatment was always framed by the ferreters as a defensive measure against Arad, yet the footage showed no signs of a dangerous child, only a boy who spent hours staring at the walls or curled in a fetal position on a bare mattress. The morning of January 28th began like any other. The deadbolt retracted. The boy was permitted to leave the garage and prepare for school. He attended Independence Middle School, a short distance from the Abacoa neighborhood. For the boy, school was not a place of academic stress, but a temporary sanctuary where the doors didn't lock from the outside. However, the psychological damage of the garage was beginning to manifest as a desperate, quiet resolve. He knew that when the final bell rang, the cycle of the clack and the bucket would resume. He didn't wait for the bell. Shortly after arriving on campus, the boy made a decision. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't act out. He simply walked. He slipped past the school's perimeter and disappeared into the sprawling palm-lined streets of Jupiter. He had no money, no phone, and no plan. Only the singular driving need to be anywhere except the 8x8 box on South Community Drive. When the school notified the ferreters that their son was missing, the carefully constructed mask of the perfect family began to crack. Timothy and Tracy didn't just call the police. They embarked on a frantic private search. They drove their SUVs through the neighborhood, their eyes scanning the walking trails and parks. This wasn't the panic of parents worried about a child's safety in the Florida sun. It was the terror of two people who realized their prisoner had escaped, taking the secrets of the garage with him. By the afternoon, the ferreters realized they could no longer keep the disappearance internal. They had to act the part of the grieving parents. They contacted the Jupiter Police Department to report RF as a runaway. Timothy, ever the executive, provided the responding officers with a polished narrative. He described a son with severe behavioral issues who had likely fled in a fit of Rady-induced rebellion. He played the role of the frustrated but devoted father to perfection, never mentioning the custom-built structure in the garage or the blue bucket. He didn't realize that by inviting the police into his life to find his runaway son, he was inviting them to look past the front porch. The investigation into a missing child was about to collide with the physical reality of the ferreters' home office. The boy was out in the world, wandering the streets of Jupiter, carrying the psychological scars of 1,000 nights in the dark. Timothy and Tracy remained in the house, waiting for the police to bring him back, unaware that the digital eye in the garage ceiling had already recorded everything necessary to destroy them. The incident wasn't just the escape. It was the moment the ferreters' arrogance led them to believe they could use the law to maintain their control. They assumed the police would see the Vietnam-born child the same way they did, as a problem to be returned to its box. They were wrong. The boy's absence was the first crack in the drywall, and the light from the outside was finally starting to leak in. The official record of the disappearance began not as a criminal investigation into child abuse, but as a standard response to a runaway juvenile. When the Jupiter Police Department dispatched officers to the South Community Drive residence, the atmosphere was one of professional urgency, the kind of response expected in a neighborhood where the median home price hovered well above 7 figures. The responding officers initially viewed the ferreters as the victims of a troubled child. They found Timothy and Tracy in a state of controlled agitation, presenting themselves as parents who had reached the end of their patience after years of dealing with a son they described as pathologically defiant. Timothy directed the officers' attention to the boy's history, explaining that his son suffered from disorders that made him prone to impulsive, dangerous behavior. He suggested that the 14-year-old had likely fled to find a way back to his roots, or simply to cause his parents further distress. This narrative was delivered with the polished conviction of a man used to giving presentations in high-stakes environments. The police began the process of gathering the necessary information for a BOLO, a Be on the Lookout alert. They asked for recent photographs, a description of the boy's clothing, and a list of locations where he might seek refuge. However, the protocol for a missing child often involves a cursory search of the home to ensure the child isn't hiding on the premises or to look for clues in their personal belongings, journals, electronics, or signs of planned flight. It was during this routine walkthrough that the polished facade of the Ferreter household began to disintegrate. The officers moved through the expansive, sun-drenched rooms of the main house. They saw the bedrooms of the biological children, spaces filled with the clutter of normal adolescence, sports equipment, high-end electronics, and posters. But when they asked to see the missing boy's room, the energy in the house shifted. There was a palpable hesitation from Timothy and Tracy. They eventually led the officers toward the garage. As the heavy door from the kitchen retracted, the officers were met with the standard sights of an Abacoa garage: high-end vehicles and organized storage. But in the corner, standing like a stark architectural anomaly, was the 8-by-8-foot structure. It looked like a temporary office or a large storage shed built directly into the floor. The detective on the scene noticed a few things immediately that didn't align with the home office description Timothy had provided. First, the smell, a sharp, unmistakable odor of human waste and stagnant air that the Florida humidity only served to amplify. Second, the door. The detective noted that the door to this structure was equipped with a deadbolt, but the lock was on the outside. There was no handle, no latch, and no way for anyone inside to exit without the assistance of someone in the garage. When Timothy was asked about the purpose of this room, he maintained his clinical tone. He explained that it was a therapeutic space, a necessary tool for managing his son's outbursts and ensuring the safety of the other children. He claimed the boy preferred it there because it provided a sensory-neutral environment. The officers requested to see the interior. Timothy produced a key and turned the deadbolt. The sound, that sharp metallic clack, echoed in the quiet garage. Inside, the officers found a scene that bore no resemblance to a bedroom or an office. They saw the single mattress on the floor, the bare plywood, and the blue plastic bucket. They saw the Ring camera mounted in the corner, its lens pointed directly at the mattress. There were no windows, no vent for air circulation, and no light that could be operated from within. The search for the boy intensified, but its nature had fundamentally changed. While patrol cars circled the area around Independence Middle School and the walking trails of Abacoa, the detectives at the house began to look at Timothy and Tracy with a new professional detachment. They were no longer just looking for a runaway. They were documenting a crime scene. Outside, the Jupiter sun beat down on the pavement as officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking neighbors if they had seen the 14-year-old. The community's reaction was a mixture of confusion and growing horror. Neighbors who had seen Timothy jogging or Tracy at the local shops struggled to reconcile the couple they knew with the police tape now cordoning off the garage. Rumors began to ripple through the gated community, whispers of a dungeon, of a boy kept in a box, of a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for months. The quiet, orderly atmosphere of Abacoa was replaced by the low hum of idling patrol cars and the intrusive glare of local news vans. Meanwhile, RF was still missing. He had been seen on school surveillance footage walking calmly toward the edge of the property, but after that, the trail went cold. The police feared that a boy who had spent the majority of his life in a windowless cell might not have the survival skills to navigate the world, or worse, that he had no intention of being found. As the sun began to set on that first day, the detectives focused on the digital evidence. They realized that the Ring camera in the garage wasn't just for live monitoring, it was recording. The search for the boy became secondary to the search for the truth contained within those servers. Timothy Ferriter stood in his driveway, still playing the role of the concerned father, unaware that the very technology he had installed to maintain his control was now systematically recording the evidence that would lead to his arrest. The search was no longer just about finding a child. It was about uncovering the full extent of the cruelty that had been designed, built, and maintained behind a deadbolt on South Community Drive. The shift from a search for a missing juvenile to a criminal inquiry happened the moment a detective's eyes adjusted to the dim light of that windowless structure. The physical evidence was undeniable, but the digital evidence would prove to be the Ferriters' ultimate undoing. When the Jupiter Police Department seized the family's electronics, they didn't just find standard household data. They discovered a server containing the automated history of a prison. The Ring camera mounted in the corner of the garage cell had been active for months. Technicians began the grueling process of reviewing over 1,700 hours of footage, a digital ledger of every minute the boy spent behind that exterior deadbolt. The images were not of a child being treated for a disorder, but of a human being being systematically erased. The detectives watched as the boy spent hours sitting on the plywood floor, his back against the drywall, staring at the door. There were no books, no electronics, no interaction. He existed in a state of sensory deprivation that mirrored solitary confinement in a maximum security penitentiary. The footage from early January 2022 was particularly damning. It showed Timothy entering the enclosure, not as a father, but as an enforcer. On multiple occasions, the camera captured him physically manhandling the 14-year-old, pinning him to the floor with the full weight of his adult frame. The boy's body appeared skeletal in the high-contrast night vision of the camera, his ribs visible, his movements sluggish. Timothy was seen shouting inches from the boy's face, his body language radiating a cold, clinical fury. He would then exit, the frame shaking as the door slammed shut, followed by the unmistakable metallic clack of the deadbolt. While the digital team processed the video, the lead investigators conducted separate interviews with the parents. Timothy's demeanor in the interrogation room was a study in corporate arrogance. He didn't deny the existence of the box. Instead, he attempted to frame it as a necessary architectural solution to a medical crisis. He lectured the detectives on the complexities of reactive attachment disorder, suggesting that they couldn't possibly understand the war zone he and Tracy lived in. He claimed the boy was a danger to the biological children, a thief, and a liar who required constant surveillance for his own protection. He spoke of the 8x8 space as a safe room, a term that felt increasingly grotesque as the evidence piled up. Tracy's interview offered a different perspective on the same cruelty. She presented as a woman who had fully internalized Timothy's narrative of victimhood. She described the boy's behavior in exhaustive detail, citing instances of him stealing food from the pantry or acting out by refusing to use the bucket in the garage. She seemed more concerned with the disruption the boy caused to their suburban lifestyle than the psychological toll of his confinement. When asked why the door locked from the outside, she simply stated that it was the only way to ensure he didn't roam the house at night. As the interviews concluded, the forensic medical team provided the results of the boy's physical examination. The 14-year-old, born in Vietnam, was found to be severely undernourished and suffering from stunted growth, a physical manifestation of the years of neglect. His psychological state was one of profound, learned helplessness. When he finally spoke to detectives in a safe house, he didn't lead with stories of physical pain. He spoke of the silence. He described the hours spent in the total darkness when his parents decided he hadn't earned the right to the light bulb. He talked about the bucket, the smell, and the feeling of the plywood against his skin. He stated that he had walked away from school that day not because of a specific argument, but because he had finally realized that the world outside the garage was larger than the world inside. The red herring that Timothy had carefully cultivated, the idea that the boy was a violent predator, was systematically dismantled by the very footage Timothy had recorded. The 1,700 hours showed no instances of the boy acting out violently against his parents or siblings. Instead, it showed a child who was almost entirely passive. a boy who had been conditioned to wait for the door to open. The investigation revealed that the biological children in the house were living a life of absolute contrast. They had access to the pool, the high-end gaming systems, and the shared family meals, all while their brother was kept in a space that local building inspectors later classified as uninhabitable for any purpose, let alone human residence. Detectives also uncovered a paper trail that showed Timothy had consulted with construction professionals about making the room soundproof. He had looked into high-grade insulation not for the comfort of the occupant, but to ensure that any cries for help or sounds of distress would never reach the ears of the neighbors or the other children in the house. This was premeditated containment. The executive had applied his project management skills to the logistics of child abuse, ensuring that every variable was controlled and every risk of exposure was minimized. The social echo in Abacoa was deafening. As the details of the investigation leaked to the local press, the new urbanism of the neighborhood felt suddenly sinister. People who had waved to Timothy on his morning runs or seen the Ferreters' SUVs at the local clubhouse were forced to confront the reality that they had lived within earshot of a dungeon. Rumors circulated about the box in the garage, and the house on South Community Drive became a local landmark of horror. The community's sense of safety was shattered, not by an outside intruder, but by the realization that the most polished family on the block was capable of the most primitive cruelty. By the time the state attorney's office reviewed the evidence, the charge was clear: aggravated child abuse. This wasn't a case of parenting at one's wit's end, as the defense would later argue. It was a case of a custom-built infrastructure of torture. The detectives had documented the construction, the surveillance, and the resulting physical and mental decay of the victim. The server that Timothy had installed to watch his son had become the primary witness for the prosecution. The 1,700 hours of video stood as a silent, digital testament to the fact that in a $1 million home in Jupiter, Florida, a child's life had been reduced to an 8 by 8 foot square of plywood and drywall. The investigation was no longer just a collection of facts. It was a comprehensive reconstruction of a suburban nightmare. The why was Timothy's need for absolute control. The how was the exterior deadbolt and the ring camera. As the case moved toward the courtroom, the boy remained in protective custody, finally living in a room where the handle was on the inside of the door. The legal reckoning in Palm Beach County became a referendum on the limits of parental authority and the definition of suburban discipline. In October 2023, Timothy Ferreter sat in a wood-paneled courtroom, his executive poise replaced by the heavy silence of a man facing the consequences of his own surveillance logs. The prosecution's case was anchored by the very drywall and digital data Timothy had curated, 1,700 hours of video that the jury watched with visible discomfort. The defense's attempt to frame the 8 by 8 foot cell as a desperate medical necessity for a broken child was dismantled by the clinical reality of the footage. The jury took only a few hours to return a verdict of guilty on all counts: aggravated child abuse, false imprisonment, and child neglect. The emotional pivot of the proceedings arrived during the victim's impact statement. The boy, no longer a prisoner of the garage, told the court through indirect testimony that his parents had treated him worse than a family pet, and that he had spent years wondering why he wasn't worthy of a handle on his door. Timothy remained stone-faced as the judge delivered a sentence of 5 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The man who had designed a cage for his son was finally ushered through a door he could not open from the inside. The $1 million home on South Community Drive has new owners, yet the garage cage remains a permanent scar on the local memory. The boy, now building a life far from the reach of Jupiter's gated communities, has finally unlearned the protocols of the box. He lives in a world where doors have handles on both sides, where his identity is no longer a diagnosis to be managed. Timothy Ferreter remains in prison, a corporate executive stripped of his rank, his freedom, and his legacy. His own 1,700 hours of digital surveillance remain as a final testament, proving that while you can build a cage, you can never truly lock away the human spirit. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.